Long after both of my parents were gone, I discovered a side of their story I had never fully known. Beginning as a teenager, my mother kept a daily diary. Not just a record of events, but a deeply personal account of what she was thinking and feeling as she lived through them. In those pages was the story of how she met my father, fell in love, and married him in a whirlwind 5-month romance. What follows is that story, drawn largely from her diary entries, written day by day as their lives unfolded in 1949.
One of the most meaningful stories in my life is how I met and married my husband. When I was 17, I began keeping a daily diary. By the time I met him, I was writing down not just what I did each day, but what I felt, honestly, impulsively, and without knowing what would come of it. What followed was a whirlwind romance. In just 5 months, we went from meeting to marriage. At the time, it felt confusing, overwhelming, and wonderful all at once. More than 70 years later, those diary entries have become something more than memories. They are a window into the heart and mind of a young girl in love, capturing, day by day, a story that would grow into a lifetime. This is that story. In January of 1949, just before my 19th birthday, I transferred to Southern California Bible College in Pasadena. I had already completed 3 semesters at Life Bible College while still living at home with my parents in Burbank, but this felt entirely different. It was a turning point. For the first time, I was on my own, living in the dorms, managing my own schedule, and finding my place among an entirely new group of people. Everything was unfamiliar, and in many ways, so was I. I still remember that first Monday morning, January 30th, walking into registration, not knowing quite what to expect. It felt as though I met millions of new people that day. Everyone seemed so friendly, and before long, I found myself thinking, I love it already. It didn't take long for me to fall in with a group of girls. There were about a dozen of us who walked up to the right spot together for something to eat, laughing the whole way. Looking back, we must have been quite a sight, full of energy, talking over one another, and enjoying every minute of it. At the time, I described them as such idiots, though I meant it in the most affectionate way. They were lively, a little mischievous, and exactly the kind of group I felt at home with. I remember thinking that I was getting in with a pretty needy gang, the sort that others might have called the rowdies of the school. For a young girl living away from home for the first time, it was all a little overwhelming, but in the best possible way. Everything felt new, full of possibility, and just beginning. The day after registration, there were still no classes, which gave us all a little more time to settle in, and in my case, to begin enjoying this new independence. Basketball practice had already started, and I was glad for that. It gave me something familiar in the middle of so much change. I had always loved playing, and it didn't take long to feel at home again on the court. That first day was full. Practice, time with friends, and then a trip downtown with Margie and Pearl that seemed to stretch on all afternoon. Margie and Pearl would become 2 of my closest friends, though at the time, we were simply 3 girls enjoying the freedom of being on our own. We laughed easily, stayed busy, and rarely seemed to run out of things to do or talk about. Somewhere in the middle of all that, I remember writing something rather bold in my diary. I had noticed a boy, Dean Gilbert, and half-jokingly told myself, I think I'll operate on him this semester. It was a silly expression of mine, but it captured something real. He had caught my attention. That evening, we had a basketball game at Los Angeles Pacific College. I played most of the game. 3 quarters, if I remember correctly, and we won, 14-9. It wasn't a high-scoring game, but it didn't matter. I was just happy to be playing again. Afterward, a group of us went out to eat at a place we called Mom's Kitchen. Everything about that night felt easy. good food, lots of laughter, and the kind of companionship that comes quickly when you're young and sharing the same experiences. Back at the dorm, the evening carried on. Girls gathered in my room, Margie, Pearl, and a handful of others, and we sat talking and laughing long past the time we should have settled down. I remember thinking how much I liked them all, even as I jokingly described some of them in less flattering terms. One girl in particular I called the cutest dope, which, in my own way, was something of a compliment. Of course, it didn't take long for us to be reminded that we were not entirely on our own. Miss Parker, whom we all referred to as Sis Parker, was in charge of the dormitories, and she took that responsibility seriously. Before long, she came down the hall to put an end to our late-night gathering and send us all back to our rooms. Looking back, I suppose we were already testing the boundaries a bit, but at the time, it simply felt like the beginning of something. New friendships, new routines, and a life that was opening up in ways I had only just begun to understand. And somewhere in the middle of it all, almost without my realizing it, Dean had already entered the picture. Classes began the next day, and with them came the first real taste of college routine. It didn't take long for me to realize that some of my ambitions, at least academically, might need adjusting. I had signed up for an Old Testament course, but after looking over the workload, I quickly began to reconsider. As I wrote at the time, it required 200-word reports 3 times per week. Too much work. In the end, I decided to drop it, though not without a little back and forth in my mind over the next couple of days. Those early days were filled with small details that felt important then: buying books, writing letters, and settling into dorm life. I even managed to flood the wash basin in our room, which felt like a fitting introduction to living away from home. Everything was new, and I was learning as I went. The weather turned cold and rainy, and we settled into a rhythm of classes, prayer meetings, and dorm life. Margie and I made plans to room together, which felt like a small victory. Having a close friend nearby made everything easier. On Thursday, we had snails for breakfast, not the kind that crawl on the ground, but a sweet pastry, something like a cinnamon roll, with the dough wrapped to resemble a snail. I remember thinking they were so yummy. By Friday, I had fully made up my mind about the Old Testament class. I guess I'll drop OT for sure. With only one class that day, and managing to be late for it, I found myself with time to spend with friends. That afternoon, Margie and I went downtown to buy paint for our room, excited to make it feel a little more like our own. On the way back, something happened that would prove far more important than anything we had done all week. Dean Gilbert got on the bus. We had spoken briefly before, but this was different. We talked for a while, and something about that simple conversation stayed with me. I didn't try to hide my reaction, even in my diary. I wrote, "He's so cute. I want to go with him so bad." Looking back, it's hard not to smile at how quickly that thought came, and how honestly I expressed it. That evening was full again. More people, more laughter, and what I described as a big conflab in my room. Somewhere in the middle of it all, I moved in with Margie, which only added to the sense that everything was shifting and settling into place. Later, we went to a basketball game at Life. The gym was full of familiar faces, and the energy of the crowd made it feel like something special. We won, and of course I noted it simply as, "We won. Natch." It was the kind of confidence that came easily in those days. Dean was there too, playing. I don't know how much I admitted to myself at the time, but seeing him there on the court only added to what I was already beginning to feel. By the end of the night, we were back in the dorm, improvising a meal of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and talking late into the evening. It was simple, a little chaotic, and full of life. And through it all, almost without realizing it, One small conversation on a bus had begun to take on a significance I would not have guessed at the time. By the time the weekend came, I found myself slipping back into familiar routines, almost without thinking about it. Even though I was living at school now, home was still very much a part of my life. That first Saturday, I hadn't even planned very well. I didn't have bus fare to get home, and my folks had to come after me. It was a small thing, but looking back, it says a lot about how new all of this still was for me. Once home, I went straight back into work at the bakery, just as I had before. My life hadn't completely changed. It had simply stretched in a new direction. School during the week, home on the weekends. That was the rhythm I was beginning to settle into. By the end of the day, I was exhausted. As I wrote then, I simply went to bed early, 'cause I'm so tired. Sundays, of course, were centered around church. That part of my life had always been important to me, and even with everything new happening at school, it remained steady. That Sunday was a little different, though. We had new pastors, McKeown from Santa Monica, and my parents had joined the Wildmans in starting a new church. It felt like another kind of beginning, not just for me, but for them as well. After church and sometime at home, I returned to Pasadena, but the day wasn't over yet. Pearl and I went to Angela's temple with a couple of boys from school, though I was quick to note in my diary, it wasn't really a date. That distinction seemed important to me at the time. Afterward, we stopped at Van de Kamp's and ran into familiar faces, Esther, Leo, Betty, and Bob, which only added to the feeling that my world was still closely connected, even as it was expanding. We ended the evening listening to Echoes, which I remember simply describing as lots of fun. Looking back, those weekends feel like a bridge between two parts of my life. At school, everything was new. New friends, new routines, new independence. But at home, so much remained the same. My parents, my work, my church, and the life I had always known. At the time, I moved easily between the two, not realizing how much things were already beginning to change. By Monday, classes were fully underway, and with them came responsibilities. We were each assigned duties, and mine was setting tables, another small part of dorm life that quickly became routine. Dean, however, was nowhere to be seen that day. I noted with some disappointment, Dean Gilbert's sick. Too bad. No operations today. Even then, I was already measuring my days, at least in part, by whether or not I would see him. Instead, Margie and I turned our attention to something more practical, making our room our own. We had decided to paint it blue, and with Pearl's help, we set to work. What began as a simple idea turned into an all-evening project, the three of us painting, laughing, and doing whatever we could to make that small space feel a little more like home. By the time we finally finished, we were too tired to do much of anything else. We ended up sleeping next door on the floor, completely worn out, but satisfied. Looking back, it was one of those small moments that didn't seem especially important at the time, but quietly marked the beginning of something. Friendships taking root, routines forming, and a place that was slowly starting to feel like our own. As the week went on, I began to see Dean more often, though never quite enough to satisfy my curiosity. On Tuesday, I noted that I had only talked to him a little bit, but even that felt like progress. There were other boys around, of course, one in particular I described as ugly but cute, which seemed to make perfect sense to me at the time. But my attention kept returning to Dean. That evening, I finally had what felt like a real opportunity. We were both on kitchen duty, he drying dishes and I setting tables, and for a few minutes after supper, we stood there talking and laughing together. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes, but I remember thinking it was a good deal. It was the first time our conversation felt easy, unhurried. Later, Margie told me he had been staring at me in class. "Uh-huh," I wrote, half pleased, half pretending not to be. By the next day, I could already feel something shifting. We talked again during kitchen duty, and this time I wrote, "I am really making a wee bit of progress." It was still something small, but to me, it felt like something definite. That same day, my mother came by with a few things from home, curtains for the room, and my little portable radio. It was a small reminder that, even as I was settling into this new life, home was never very far away. Thursday brought more of the same, and more of him. We were both in the kitchen again, and this time we talked longer. I didn't hesitate to record my opinion. He is luscious. It was a bold statement, but it was exactly how I felt. I began finding ways to be near him whenever I could. I sat behind him in class all morning and privately gave him a nickname, Loverboy. Whether I meant it seriously or not, I wasn't entirely sure. The days were full. Classes, music lessons, basketball practice, prayer meetings. But even in the middle of everything else, I found myself thinking about him more and more. There were still rules to follow, of course. Dating wasn't allowed until 6 weeks into the term, something I was already very aware of. When another boy asked me to go out, I had to clear it with Sis Parker, who made it quite clear I wouldn't be going anywhere alone. Even so, it didn't seem to matter much. Without ever saying it out loud, I was already focused on Dean. By Friday, it felt as though something had begun to take shape between us. We had a basketball game that day, and I remember that Dean spoke to me before supper, and again during the game. At some point, I found myself sitting beside him, wearing his jacket while he was out on the court. It was a small thing, but it felt like more than that. I didn't try to disguise my excitement. "Things are really going good. He's so cute," I wrote, adding that he had said we would have to go out sometime. Oh boy. Looking back, it was all moving very quickly. The snow party at Big Bear marked something of a turning point. From the moment we arrived, Dean and I seemed to find our way to each other. We sat together at lunch, talked easily, and before long slipped away for a few minutes alone. I remember writing that we flirted, which was my way of describing something I probably didn't yet fully understand. We walked down to the lake, away from the others, and it was there that he first held my hand. It was such a simple thing, but it stayed with me. The rest of the day passed in a kind of happy blur, tobogganing, snow falling steadily around us, and the quiet awareness that we were together almost constantly. I noted that everyone was so jealous and shocked, though at the time, I may have enjoyed that more than I cared to admit. On the ride home, I sat with him the entire way. I summed it up rather simply in my diary. Oh, baby. Even now, I can't help but smile at that. Car trouble delayed us, and we didn't return until late. Somewhere along the way, he tried to kiss me. I wasn't quite ready for that, though I didn't exactly keep my distance either. As I wrote, we necked the whole way home, without kissing. It was all very new, and I was trying to understand my own feelings as much as anything else. When we finally arrived, he walked me to the dorm door before saying goodnight. A small gesture, but one that mattered. The next day brought a different kind of excitement and a bit of trouble. After church, Dean told me he wanted to go out that evening. The problem, of course, was that we weren't supposed to. Dating rules were still in place, and somehow Sis Parker already seemed to know exactly what I was thinking before I even asked. Even so, I went home that afternoon as planned, and that evening, Dean came out to see me. I remember thinking how handsome he looked. He looked gorgeous, I wrote, and I meant it. We went to the Burbank Foursquare Church together, and I couldn't help noticing how much attention it drew. It felt as though everyone was watching us, though whether that was true or not, I'm not sure. Afterward, we went back to my house, where my parents fed us and then drove us back to school. It was all perfectly proper on the surface, though I knew well enough that I had already stepped a little outside the rules. When he said goodnight, he kissed me, but it was so quick that I wasn't even sure what to think of it. I wrote, "I don't know whether it was good or not." It was an honest reaction, and probably exactly how I felt. Behind the scenes, my mother was already trying to smooth things over, speaking with Sis Parker in hopes of getting me out of what I had gotten myself into. Monday, I half expected to hear something from Sis Parker about the night before, but no word came. I noted it simply. No word from Sis Parker. Good. It felt like a small victory. That afternoon, Dean and I met after class and went for a walk, something we both knew was against the rules. We wandered over to a little lake near campus, and once again he took my hand. I remember thinking it was so cute, though by then it was already becoming something more familiar. After practice, he came into the practice room to see me. We talked for a while, and before long he tried again to kiss me. I still wasn't quite ready for that, though I wasn't exactly discouraging him either. I wrote at the time, "He is really hot stuff, that boy," which probably says everything about how I felt. There was always that sense that we might be caught, which only added to the excitement. If we would have been caught, "Oh," I wrote, knowing full well we were pushing things further than we should. Eventually, I made him leave, though not without some reluctance on both sides. As I admitted rather honestly, things were getting too bad. Good. Even then, I understood the contradiction. I still didn't let him kiss me, though I wasn't entirely sure why. "I'm naughty, though," I wrote, which again was probably closer to the truth than I realized. That evening settled back into routine. Missionary prayers, the library, and an attempt to study. Dean and I sat near each other, though I don't think either of us got much work done. We talked for a few minutes, just enough to keep everything going. At one point, he suggested I sneak out. I dismissed it at the time. "What a joker," I wrote, but I also added something more telling. "He's not very good for me, I don't think." Even then, I could see it, at least a little, and yet I also knew I wasn't about to stay away. The next day felt a little more settled, though Dean was still very much at the center of it. We sat together in all of our classes, something that had quickly become routine. After school, we went downtown together, and I remember thinking simply, "He's sweet." It wasn't dramatic, but it was sincere, and it meant something. That day was also my birthday. Dean gave me a card, which felt thoughtful in a way that stayed with me. It wasn't anything elaborate, but it was enough to make the day feel special. Later, my parents came over to the dorm, bringing ice cream and cake. Before long, a group of about 15 girls had gathered, and what had started as something small turned into a little celebration. I had known about it ahead of time, of course, but I still did my best to act surprised. It was one of those moments where both parts of my life seemed to come together. My parents, my new friends, and this new world I was beginning to feel a part of. My folks had also bought me an aqua knitted dress, though it didn't quite work out. It didn't fit, and they ended up taking it back. At the time, it was just one of those small disappointments, quickly forgotten in everything else that was going on. By the end of the day, I found myself back in the library with Dean. Even there, where I was supposed to be studying, my attention was divided. Looking back, it's clear that what had started just days before had already become part of my everyday life, and I wasn't trying very hard to change that. The next day was, in my words, a super day, and for good reason. I found small ways to be useful to Dean, which I think I enjoyed more than I realized at the time. I fixed a hole in his wine-colored shirt, something simple, but it gave me an excuse to feel a little connected to his everyday life. That afternoon, we played tennis together and ended up winning in doubles. It was the kind of easy, happy time that seemed to come more naturally the more we were together. Later, we went to the library, though I don't think much studying was accomplished. Instead, we sat and wrote notes back and forth, carrying on quiet conversations even when we were supposed to be working. By then, it was becoming harder to go unnoticed. His roommates had already begun teasing us something awful, which only confirmed what everyone else was starting to see. And yet, for all the time we spent together, it was surprisingly difficult to find even a few moments alone. That evening, I met him at the candy store, but even then, there always seemed to be others around. I remember writing, "I never get to see him alone," and it was true. Between the rules and the constant presence of other students, privacy was almost impossible. There was also a growing awareness that we had to be careful. I admitted that I was often afraid to talk to him for fear of getting in trouble, which added a kind of tension to everything we did. And somewhere in the middle of it all, there was still school to think about. I wrote, "I've got to get down to studying. It's awful." A reminder that while everything else seemed to be moving forward, some things were beginning to fall behind. Looking back, it was a strange balance. Friendship, attraction, rules, expectations, all unfolding at once. And somehow, we kept finding our way back to each other in the middle of it. By Thursday, being together had begun to feel almost natural. We sat by each other in all of our classes, and I remember writing quite simply, "I love being with him. I feel so at ease." It wasn't complicated. It just felt right. That afternoon, we found time to meet at the tennis courts. We called it tennis, though I admitted it was really a big cover-up. In truth, we spent most of the time sitting and talking. It was during that conversation that we tried to define what was happening between us. We decided that our little romance would remain on a friendship basis. Nothing serious, no expectations. It seemed like a sensible solution at the time. No one will get hurt that way, we told ourselves. Looking back, it's hard not to see the irony in that. We talked about all sorts of things, our ideas, our beliefs, even our philosophy of life. It felt deeper than anything we had shared before, and yet at the same time, we were trying to convince ourselves to keep it light. He held my hand as we sat there, and for a while, everything felt very simple. Later, he had to leave with the basketball team for Santa Barbara. Before he went, he came down to say goodbye, another small moment that seemed to matter more than it should have. That evening, I felt his absence more than I expected. I wrote, "It's lonely with him gone just one evening," which probably said more than I intended. The rest of the night returned to ordinary things, time in the library with Pearl, errands with Margie, but it all felt a little quieter without him there. Looking back, I think that was the first time I began to realize just how much he had already become a part of my everyday life. Friday felt light and easy from the start. There was only one class, and before long, a group of us had decided to go ice skating. Dean and I went together, and I surprised myself a little. I wrote, "I can really skate," which I hadn't entirely expected. We spent most of the afternoon on the ice, and I remember it simply as such fun. It wasn't just the skating, it was being together. By then, I had begun to notice the small things about him, the sweet little things, as I called them, the way he held my hand, the way he looked at me. Those details stayed with me. I did manage to fall a couple of times, though I added, perhaps a bit defensively, that I was practically pushed. That evening, there were basketball games. Both the girls' and boys' teams played, and we won them both. Dean came and watched the girls' game with me, which I noticed more than I might have admitted at the time. Afterward, a group of us went out together, Dean and I, along with Margie, Pearl, and a few others, to a drive-in. It was there that something happened that felt like another small step forward. He kissed me. I described it as so cute, though I was also quite honest in saying he doesn't kiss too well. Even so, I quickly added that his ways are precious, which, in the end, seemed to matter more. He kissed me again before we went in, and I found myself thinking about him in a way I hadn't quite put into words before. He's definitely the lover boy type, I wrote, and even wondered what that might mean. I added, perhaps a little boldly, I think he'd be very passionate. What I didn't try to hide was how much I wanted that closeness. After spending so much time together that week, with so many restrictions around us, I admitted, I was just dying to have him kiss me. It had been, in every sense, a full day. And then, at the very end, came a reminder that things were not entirely as carefree as they felt. Sis Parker wants to see me Monday. Oh. Even then, I knew that all of this, however exciting, was beginning to draw attention. Saturday followed the now familiar pattern: school, then home, then back again. I did my duties and went home, slipping easily into the routines that had always been part of my life. I baked cookies, did some washing, and worked at the bakery that afternoon. In many ways, it was the same life I had always known, just now woven in between everything happening at school. That evening, I went back to campus for a basketball game. I saw Dean beforehand, and we talked for a while, and afterward, we found a chance to be together, this time, for the first time, alone. We rode around for a bit and then parked. It was something new for both of us. No rules immediately around us, no one watching, and I was very aware of that. I wrote simply, "First time we've ever been alone." We sat there talking and holding each other, and as I put it at the time, we necked. It was still all very new, but already changing. I even noted, with a kind of amused honesty, he kisses better now than the first time. More than anything, I remember thinking how much I enjoyed being with him. He's such a character, I wrote, which seemed to capture something of both his charm and unpredictability. By the time I got home, it was late, around 1:30, and the day felt full in every way. Sunday brought a different rhythm again: church, family, and the routines that had always been steady in my life. We went to Sunday school and church, at the new church my parents were helping to build with the Wildmans. Later, Dean came over to the house, and in one of those small, ordinary moments, I even plucked his eyebrows, something that felt strangely natural at the time. We went to church together that evening, and afterward sat parked in front of the house, where he kissed me a few more times. By then, that part of our relationship was becoming familiar, though not necessarily simple. For all the closeness, there was also a growing tension beneath it. I admitted to myself, he makes me mad sometimes. There were moments when it felt as though he was careful not to take things too seriously, even reminding me that what we had might not have a future. I tried to match that attitude. So what? Neither am I wrote, as if saying it would make it true. But even then, I wasn't entirely convinced. That night, my parents drove us back to school, and somewhere along the way, he kissed me again and again. It should have made everything feel simple, but instead, I found myself unsure. I guess I'm just mixed up tonight, I wrote. I don't know how I feel about him. And yet, even in that uncertainty, I added one more thought, honest as ever. He's so cute, it is hard to dislike him. Monday brought the first real consequences of how much time we had been spending together. I went to classes as usual and sat with Dean, but the rest of the day felt unsettled. At some point, I was called in for what I described as a big talk with Sis Parker about being with him so much. It was clear that our time together had not gone unnoticed. For a while that afternoon, I didn't see him at all. Instead, I wrote him a letter, simply because I couldn't talk to him any other way. Even that felt a little frustrating. By evening, things slipped back into something more familiar. We ended up in the library together, though I admitted I didn't get anything done. Instead, we wrote notes back and forth, carrying on our own quiet conversation in the middle of the room. He wrote me a letter as well, which only added to the feeling that we were finding ways around whatever stood in our way. Later that night, we met at the candy store for a few minutes, sometime around 9:30 or 10 o'clock. It wasn't much time, but it was enough. Even with the restrictions, we still managed to find each other. Tuesday felt lighter, at least at first. I described it simply as a needy day, though most of the students had gone to the beach. I stayed behind, moving through classes as usual and sitting with Dean whenever I could. We ate lunch together and later walked down to watch some of the others playing tennis. It was the kind of easy time that had become familiar. Nothing especially planned, just being together. In the middle of it, he mentioned that he would be going home the following weekend. I noted it in my own way. Sniff, sniff, half joking but not entirely. Even then, I didn't like the idea of him being gone. The weather was so nice that studying didn't stand much of a chance. I tried, but I admitted it was simply too pleasant to stay focused. That evening carried its usual mix of routine and small moments. Margie just made it back before Sis Parker came around to check on us, which was always something to be mindful of. I spent some time in the typing room, and Dean came in for a while so we could talk. Back in the room, Pearl made deviled egg sandwiches, another small detail that somehow made its way into the day. Later, I had planned to meet Dean at the candy store, but he had gone to bed sick instead. It was a small disappointment, but enough to be felt. Even in a day that seemed ordinary, I was already beginning to notice how much those little moments with him mattered. Wednesday was a quiet day, though it didn't feel that way to me. Dean was sick and gone all day, and I found myself thinking about him more than I expected. I wrote him a couple of letters, even drew a picture, and sent along a candy bar. Small things, but they seemed important at the time. I went to classes as usual, trying to keep to my routine, but my attention kept drifting. When I heard from him, it lifted my spirits more than I might have admitted. I remember writing that his letter was the cutest, just dreamy, and I answered him again right away. The rest of the day passed as it usually did, time with other students, chapel, and a trip to the library. But something was different. Without him there, I noticed the absence. I missed Dean today. I didn't think I would, but I did, I wrote, surprised at my own reaction. And then, almost as if I were asking myself a question I wasn't quite ready to answer, I added, I wonder just how well I do like him. Looking back, it was a simple thought, but an honest one. And it marked the first time I began to wonder just how much this meant to me. Thursday was gray and rainy. A nasty day, as I put it, but in spite of that, I was able to be with Dean for much of it. We sat together in all of our classes, which had become our usual pattern, but there was something new beneath it all. I learned that Sis Parker had asked Brother Miller to speak with Dean about how much time we were spending together. That made everything feel a little more serious. Even so, we still found time. We talked for a while before evening chapel, just 20 minutes or so. But it was enough. Later, he came down to the library, and I remember writing something very simple and very true. It gives me a good feeling just to be near him. By then, I knew he would be leaving for the weekend, going to Fresno, and I felt it more than I expected. I'm going to miss him so much, I wrote, not trying to hide it anymore. The rest of the evening moved along as usual, time at the candy store, basketball practice, but everything seemed to carry that same quiet awareness. Even with the rules, the watchfulness, and the growing pressure around us, one thing hadn't changed. I still wanted to be near him. Friday felt scattered, with a little of everything. Margie and I borrowed a car and drove down to Life to check on my grades, then made a stop at Bunny's to see about getting Jim Belmore's ring. It was one of those days filled with errands and small plans, none of which seemed especially important on their own. We were late getting back and missed the start of chapel, which did not go unnoticed. Sis Parker was not pleased, and I knew we were pushing things more than we should. I did see Dean for a few minutes, about 15, I noted, before he left for Fresno. It wasn't long, but it mattered. By then, even short conversations felt important. After he left, I went home on the bus, returning again to that familiar weekend routine. But this time, it felt different. His absence was more noticeable than it had been before. That evening, I went to the library and finally settled down to study, working on my Jehovah's Witness theme. It was one of the few times that week I seemed to focus on school without distraction. Saturday was, by my own account, not especially memorable. I spent most of the day working on a report, morning, afternoon, and evening, moving between schoolwork and my usual shift at the bakery. There was little else to note, and I summed it up at the time with a bit of dry humor. Big, eventful day. Joke. Sunday brought a little more life to it. I went to Sunday school at the church my parents were helping to build with the Wildmans, and then to church in Burbank. By now, that back and forth between school and home had become a familiar rhythm. When I returned to campus, I said goodbye to Alma, who was leaving the next day for Texas. It was one of those quiet moments that didn't seem especially important at the time, but still lingered. The evening, however, took on a different tone. Pearl, Margie, and I spent hours talking, what I described as a big gab feast, about men and stuff. It was the kind of conversation that seemed to come easily, full of laughter, opinions, and all the questions that go along with everything we were beginning to experience. Looking back, it was a simple night, but one that somehow fit perfectly into that season of life. Monday brought a few small changes. I started new duties in the girls' dorm, another shift in the routine of school life. Between that and classes, the day moved along as usual. But, as always, Dean was part of it. We sat together in class and found a few minutes to talk before lunch, small moments that had become part of each day. Later, I went downtown to have my school pictures taken for the annual, one of those little milestones that seemed important at the time. That evening, after missionary prayers, Dean and I made plans for the coming weekend. We decided to go to Santa Ana together, where the school had recently acquired property on the old Santa Ana Air Base, actually located in Costa Mesa, for what would someday become a new campus. At the time, I didn't think much about the significance of the place itself, but looking back, it would come to mean far more to me than I could have imagined. Even writing it down, I could hardly believe it. "It doesn't seem possible that I'm going with him," I wrote, adding in my own way, "What a doll." The thought of it stayed with me the rest of the day. I did manage to spend some time studying history that evening, though I'm not sure how much of it truly held my attention. March began on a more difficult note. The morning started simply enough. I had a history test and was pleased to find I had earned a B, 10 out of 12. It was a small success, and under other circumstances, I might have enjoyed it more. By then, Dean had been assigned morning duty sweeping classrooms, which meant I saw him at the start of each day. Those few minutes had become something I counted on. We sat together in classes as usual, and for a while everything felt normal. But that evening, things changed. We were sitting together in the library when Brother Miller came in, walked over, and tapped Dean on the shoulder, asking him to step into the other room. It was sudden and unmistakable. Dean didn't take it well. He got up, clearly upset, and walked out. I was left sitting there, not knowing quite what to do. I remember how quickly my emotions rose. I was angry, confused, and close to tears all at once. I almost cried, I wrote, and that was exactly how it felt. It didn't seem fair to me. No one else gets picked on, I told myself, convinced that we were being singled out. I went back to my room and wrote him a letter, sending it along by Belmore, just to say something, anything. Afterward, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I went upstairs and cried. At the time, it all felt overwhelming. As if that weren't enough, Pearl left that day for Springfield, which only added to the sense that things were shifting around me. Looking back, it was one of the first moments when the outside pressure became impossible to ignore. And I was feeling it more deeply than I had before. The next day felt calmer, though everything from the night before was still in the background. I saw Dean during duty time that morning, and just being with him again seemed to settle things. I wrote simply, "He's so sweet," which, after everything, felt like the most important thing to hold on to. The day moved along in its usual way: classes, chapel, and the cold, rainy weather that seemed to match the mood of the week. We sat together in class as always, and I remember thinking, what would school be like without him? It wasn't a dramatic thought, but it was an honest one. That afternoon, I watched him working on his car, which felt like a bit of a risk, given how closely we were being watched. Even simple things like that carried a sense that we might be pushing too far. There were lighter moments, too. The students held a surprise birthday party for Sis Parker, which felt almost ironic, given everything that had been happening. Life at school went on, even as tensions quietly built underneath. I spent some time working on my Jehovah's Witness theme, trying to keep up with schoolwork, though my attention didn't always stay where it should. Later, I saw Dean again after supper, and we made a small but important adjustment to our weekend plans. Instead of leaving from school, we decided we would go to Santa Ana from my house on Sunday. It seemed like a simple change, but it also felt like a way of working around the rules that were becoming harder to ignore. Not everything around us was so simple. One of the girls, Betty Pudgy Loffman, had been expelled, a reminder of how serious the expectations at school really were. Even so, in the middle of it all, I kept coming back to the same feeling. I still wanted to be with him. Thursday brought a sense of relief. Sis Parker had left for Springfield, and I couldn't help but note it with a little excitement. Whee! It felt, at least for the moment, as though the pressure had lifted. Dean and I saw each other during duty time, and that afternoon we went out to the tennis courts again. As before, tennis was more of an excuse than an activity. We spent most of the time sitting and talking, enjoying the chance to be together without quite as many watchful eyes. At one point, we walked down toward the gym, and there, in a quiet moment, he kissed me, just briefly. I remember how nervous I was, certain someone might see us at any moment. I was so afraid someone would catch us, I wrote. And yet, just as quickly, I admitted, it was so sweet. Lover boy. Not every moment was quite so tender. Later, in ancient history class, I found myself irritated with him for putting chewing gum on my book, and on me, which felt less charming in the moment than it might have been otherwise. The day went on as usual, music lesson, routines. But by evening, the sense of freedom hadn't entirely worn off. A few of us, Margie, Naomi, and I, decided to push things a little further. We slipped out and went to the right spot instead of chapel, and later had to crawl back in through a classroom window to get inside. It was the kind of thing that felt daring at the time, another small step beyond the rules we were supposed to be following. Friday felt quieter by comparison. I was surprised to see Dean at breakfast, which gave us a few extra minutes together. We talked again during duty time and sat together in class, small routines that had become part of each day. Margie and I went downtown for a while, though the rain came down steadily the entire time, making it less of an outing than we had hoped. By evening, things had slowed. Dean was working, and without much else going on, we turned in early. It was a simple day, nothing dramatic, but even in its quietness, everything still seemed to revolve around the same thing. Seeing him when I could, and missing him when I couldn't. Saturday carried that familiar rhythm of going home, but this time, it felt different from the start. I rode the bus with Bob Shepard, worked my usual shift at the bakery, and then returned to school for a basketball game against Beulah College. We won, and afterward, Dean and I went out for something to eat at Bob's Big Boy. From there, we went on to Burbank. He came home with me that night and stayed over, which in itself felt like something new. At some point, we slipped away for a while, just the two of us, and I remember how hard it was to say goodnight. I just hated to say goodnight to him so bad, I wrote, trying to capture the feeling. We seemed to fall into an easy closeness, as though everything between us had settled into place. We hit it off to perfection, I wrote, and that was exactly how it felt at the time. By the time the night ended, it was late, around 2:30, and I remember thinking simply, he's so sweet. Sunday began quietly. I remember noticing something as simple as how he looked that morning. Dean looks so cute in PJs, I wrote, as we sat reading the funny papers together. It was such an ordinary moment, but one that stayed with me. From there, we set out for Santa Ana. We went to see the property the school had recently acquired on the old Santa Ana Air Base, actually located in Costa Mesa, for what would someday become a new campus. At the time, I didn't think much about the significance of the place itself, but looking back, it would come to mean far more to me than I could have imagined. We continued on to Balboa, down to the point, where we sat on the sand and ate our lunch. The day was simple, talking, resting, being together, but it felt full in a different way. I didn't try to hide how I felt. Love to love that boy, I wrote, adding that he was so affectionate, exactly what I need. It was one of the clearest expressions yet of what was growing between us. Later, we went to church at Burbank Foursquare, returning again to the routines that had always been part of my life. Afterward, we found a few quiet minutes together before heading back. By then, everything felt deeper, more certain, and yet still not fully defined. I wrote that we had had more lovin' today than for a long time, a phrase that, in its own way, said everything. That evening, Billy and Gordon Johnson brought us back to school. Looking back, it felt like one of those weekends where something shifted, not all at once, but enough to know that things were no longer quite the same as before. Monday felt slower after the weekend. I even managed to sleep through breakfast, which was unusual for me, and the day never quite seemed to catch up after that. I saw Dean briefly after lunch, and he gave me a picture of himself from an old quartet he had been in. I remember thinking it was so cute, and it felt like one of those small things that mattered more than it should have. Later, I went downtown to pick up the pictures we had taken the week before. I looked them over and decided they were not too bad, which was about as enthusiastic as I was willing to be. Dean was working that evening, so there wasn't much time together, and I began to feel a cold coming on. By the end of the day, I noted it plainly. I've got a nasty cold. It was a quieter day, without much happening on the surface, but even then, the small moments still seemed to stand out. Tuesday began like any other day. Classes, routine, and the steady rhythm of school. But it didn't stay that way for long. After lunch, Dean and I went out to the tennis courts and played for a while, though, as usual, it was as much talking as it was tennis. I remember noting that my tennis is improving a wee bit, which may or may not have been entirely accurate. While we were there, something came up that changed the tone of the afternoon. Dean had received letters, one from a girl named Rosie in Reedley, and another from his mother, who apparently already knew about me. It created what I described as a big mess. For the first time, I felt something from outside our little world pressing in on what we had been building. We talked for a long time, and once again, he made it clear that he didn't want to get serious. He had said it before, and now he repeated it. I listened, though I wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. At the same time, we were already making plans for him to come over again that weekend. Looking back, I can see the contradiction plainly, but at the time, I held on to what mattered most to me. I told myself, if it's the Lord's will, it'll all work out, trying to place it in a framework I understood. And in the middle of all that uncertainty, I wrote something that was as honest as anything I had put down. He's really my ideal. Everything about him is perfect. It scares me, because I've never met anyone like that before. It was a realization that felt both exciting and unsettling. And I think I understood even then that I was getting in deeper than I had planned. By Wednesday, being together had become part of my everyday life. We talked during duty time, and I realized that I was now eating most of my meals with him. It felt easy, natural. It's fun, I wrote, and that simple description seemed to cover it. That afternoon, we decided to go for a walk after class. We wandered down toward the lake, stopping to watch the ducks for a while, and then continued on, climbing up into the hills. It felt quiet there, away from everything, and we eventually came across a small hidden spot among the trees. There was a bench there. Someone had carved into it for lovers only. I remember thinking it was cute and somehow fitting. We sat there together, and he kissed me again. By then, I wasn't holding back my feelings. I love to kiss that boy, I wrote, adding with complete honesty, it's a weakness. It was something I was beginning to recognize about myself. The more it happened, the harder it was to stop. I hate to quit kissing him. It grows on me, I admitted, which was probably as truthful as anything I'd written. Eventually, we made our way back to school, returning to the routines we were supposed to be following. That evening, we were in the library again, though even there the pressure hadn't gone away. At one point, Sis Miller made him move his seat, another small reminder that we were still being watched. Later, we went to the bookstore together, and I noticed Brother Miller nearby, giving us what I described as dirty looks. Even in the middle of everything, classes, rules, expectations, we kept finding ways to be together. And each time, it seemed to matter a little more. Thursday began like so many others. Seeing Dean during duty time, sitting together in classes, and enjoying the simple closeness that had become part of each day. I wrote, I enjoy sitting with him so much, and that was as true as ever. At lunch, we decided to walk up to the right spot for Cokes, something we had done before without much thought, but this time felt different. I remember having a funny feeling about it, though I couldn't quite explain why. We went anyway. On the way, Brother Miller drove up beside us and honked. There was nothing we could do. We were already there, already seen. I remember how quickly the fear set in. I was so scared, I wrote, and my thoughts went immediately to what would happen next. Dean will really get in trouble tomorrow, I worried. I hope he doesn't get campused. It suddenly felt serious in a way it hadn't before. I could already imagine Brother Miller reporting it to Sister Parker when she returned. "What a mess," I wrote, trying to make light of something that didn't feel light at all. By evening, things had quieted, but the tension lingered. Dean was working, and without him there, it felt like a dull end to the day. Life in the dorm went on. Margie received a box from home filled with cookies, cheese, and apples, but my thoughts kept circling back to what might happen next. Friday brought the answer. Brother Miller had spoken with Dean, though it turned out not to be as severe as I had feared. Still, we were careful. We avoided being seen together as much as possible, aware now that we were being watched more closely than ever. Even so, the day moved forward. I bought some yarn with the idea of making Dean a pair of argyle socks, another small way of thinking about him, even when we weren't together. That afternoon, I went home on the bus and later attended the wedding rehearsal for Esther and Leo at the Baptist church. There were dresses to try on and details to work out, though not everything fit quite right, and there was talk of needing to make changes. Afterward, we gathered at Leo's for cake and ice cream, along with a few others, including the twins. It was a warm, ordinary kind of evening, full of conversation and small celebrations. And yet, even in the middle of it, part of my attention remained elsewhere. Things had changed. We were no longer as free as we had been just days before. But that didn't seem to lessen how much it all mattered. Saturday was full from the beginning. I had a dentist appointment in the morning, then worked my usual shift at the bakery before heading back to school for a basketball game. By then, the day already felt long, but what followed made it something else entirely. Dean came over again for the weekend. We went up to Esther's, where there was a kind of informal gathering, girls having a slumber party and their dates coming and going. The evening turned into one of those lively, crowded nights, games, laughter, and everyone talking at once. It went on late, until around 2 a.m. Somewhere in the middle of it, Dean and I found a few moments to ourselves. By the time we finally got home, it was nearly 4. I remember writing, "What a boy," half amused, half overwhelmed by it all. Looking back, it's clear how strongly I was feeling things by then. I wrote, "He'll be my downfall yet," and even admitted to a kind of intensity that surprised me. There was something about him that pulled at me in a way I hadn't experienced before. "He just sends me," I said. And yet, even in the middle of all that, there was another side to it. I couldn't ignore the fact that he still insisted on keeping things light, never serious. That contradiction was already beginning to frustrate me. Sunday came too quickly. I was exhausted, so sleepy, I wrote, but the day moved forward anyway. I taught Sunday school, had dinner at home, and tried to rest in the afternoon while my parents were out. But rest didn't quite happen. Instead, I found myself caught up again in the same strong pull toward him, something I was beginning to struggle to understand. "I don't know what to do about that boy," I wrote, recognizing that my feelings were becoming harder to manage. He had a way of affecting me that felt both exciting and unsettling. "He drives me crazy," I admitted. That evening, we went to Crusaders and then to church in Glendale, returning again to the familiar patterns of my life. On the drive back, he kissed me, and for a moment, everything felt simple again. And yet, even then, I could see both sides of it. I could really marry him, I wrote, an extraordinary thought, given how little time had passed, but just as quickly, I pulled back from it. "I don't love him yet," I told myself, though I added something more revealing. I was afraid that I might, because even as I was feeling all of this, he continued to remind me that he would never get serious. And somewhere in the middle of those two realities, I found myself unsure of where I stood. Monday felt unsettled from the start. I slept through breakfast again and spent most of the day with Dean, sitting together in class, talking whenever we could, stretching those small moments out as long as possible. By then, it had become second nature to find our way back to each other. But there was something new beneath it. At some point, he told me he would be going to see Rosie the following weekend. "Oh, goody," I wrote, though I meant exactly the opposite. It was the first time I felt that particular kind of irritation, something sharper than anything before. I didn't say much at the time, but it stayed with me. Later, I went downtown to the library, trying to settle into something more productive. Back at school, I noted that it was good to have Pearl back again, but I also couldn't help adding that I was glad Sis Parker was still gone. That, too, seemed to matter. Tuesday made everything a little clearer. Classes filled the day, but I could feel a kind of tension in Dean that hadn't been there before. We found a quiet place to sit out in the sun before ancient history, and I brought along my knitting, something that had always felt familiar and steady to me. After class, he received another letter from Rosie. We went back outside and sat together again, and this time we talked more seriously. I told him honestly how it was affecting me, that the whole situation with him and Rosie was beginning to wear on me, that I was getting tired of it. He said he had written to her, explaining about me. I listened, but I wasn't entirely reassured. For the first time, I allowed myself to say what I had been thinking. If things didn't change after that weekend, if he continued seeing her, I would have to end it. I couldn't keep going like that. It wasn't said dramatically, just plainly. Later, Frances made a comment that it ran in the family to be fickle, which didn't help matters much. Even so, the day settled back into its usual pattern. We went to the library, ate supper together, and sat side by side as we had so many times before. But something had shifted. For the first time, I was beginning to think not just about how much I cared for him, but about whether I could keep going if nothing changed. Wednesday was not especially productive, at least not in the way it should have been. I spent most of the morning knitting, something I'd done all my life and could fall into without thinking. I even noted it with a bit of sarcasm. Fine way to get my studies done. And of course, it wasn't. That afternoon, Dean and I played tennis again, though it ended rather abruptly when I managed to get hit in the head with the ball. It was the sort of thing that would have been more amusing if it hadn't actually happened. But the day didn't really turn on any of that. Dean received another letter from Rosie. This time, she wrote that she was hurt, though she believed things would be worked out when he came to see her that weekend. Hearing that only made everything feel more unsettled. I didn't try to hide my reaction. "Grrr," I wrote, which probably said it as clearly as anything else could have. By then, I was done waiting for things to sort themselves out. There's gotta be a decision on his part. That's all there is to it. It was the first time I'd put it so plainly. And I meant it. Thursday brought everything to the surface again. Dean and I were standing together, talking before duties, when Beck came down and told us that Sis Parker wanted us to quit it. There was no mistaking what that meant. I went in to see her, and she told me plainly that we were together more than anyone else on campus. I remember how quickly it hit me. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I was so mad, I wrote. I just sat there and cried. It felt unfair, even if part of me knew there was some truth in it. After that, the day went on as it had to. We went to classes, and I still sat with Dean. He walked me back to the dorm and then on to work, small gestures that hadn't changed, even if everything around them had. Chapel came and went, and by evening, I found myself back in the familiar rhythm of knitting. Quiet, repetitive, something steady to hold on to when everything else felt unsettled. I finally finished one sock. It was a small accomplishment, but it felt like something I could control. Friday carried a different kind of feeling. I went to class as usual, and Dean walked me up to the bus afterward, one of those small, thoughtful things that had come to mean so much to me. The rest of the day was taken up with the wedding. I helped Leota at the reception, working on decorations and getting everything ready. There was a sense of excitement in it all, a break from the usual routines and tensions of school life. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Everything came together just as it should, and I remember writing simply, "Everything went off swell." Esther and Leo were married, and it felt like something important, something worth celebrating. Afterward, we gathered for the reception. I was already tired by then, but still caught up in the moment. As part of the wedding, we were given Bibles and lace handkerchiefs, small keepsakes that seemed meaningful at the time. "It was such fun being in the wedding," I wrote, and it truly was. For a little while, everything else seemed to fade into the background. Saturday felt ordinary again, though not without its moments. I spent the morning at the dentist and then settled into a few small tasks, mending clothes, the kind of practical things I had always done without much thought. Later, I went to work at the bakery, keeping to the usual routine. Somewhere in the middle of it, I received a letter from Enos. He had been someone I'd dated the year before, but whatever interest had once been there had clearly faded. His letter, though, was full of urgency. He was coming home on furlough and wanted to know if he could call me. He just begged, too, which struck me more as amusing than flattering. I didn't take it very seriously. "What a joker! Big schmo," I wrote, dismissing it in my own way. It was a sharp contrast to everything I was feeling now. By evening, I turned back to schoolwork, typing on my spiritualism report for personal living. It wasn't especially exciting, but it was something to focus on, something steady in the middle of everything else that seemed to be shifting. Sunday felt steady at first. I went to Sunday school at the Wildmans, then came home instead of staying for church, trying to get some studying done before heading back to school. After supper, a few of us gathered around the piano, Herb Hiller, Pearl, Margaret, and I, passing the time in a way that felt familiar and easy. Then Dean called. He phoned the dorm around 7:30, and before long, he came over. We walked up to the right spot and found a place out back where we could sit and talk, just the two of us. This time, I didn't hold back. I told him plainly that I couldn't share him with Rosie. It wasn't said lightly, it had been building for days, and now it finally came out. We talked for a long time, trying to sort through something that didn't seem to have a simple answer. He said he would break things off with her. But even then, there was a condition. We would still go out, but not steady. I remember how I tried to make sense of it at the time. We are in actions, but not in word. So dumb. It didn't quite add up, but I accepted it anyway. He kissed me a few times before the night was over, and once again I felt that same pull. I wrote, "He leaves me weak. We just plain affect each other." It was as simple and as complicated as that. On Monday, our duties had changed, and Margie and I were now assigned to special breakfast, pouring juice in the mornings. It was a small adjustment, one more part of the routine that kept everything moving. The day itself was pleasant. A needy, warm day, I wrote. And I saw Dean for a while in the afternoon before he went to work. For a time, everything felt light again. But underneath it, something had changed. The night before, we had tried once more to define what we were doing. We had agreed that we would just be buddies, nothing serious, ever. Even writing it down, it didn't quite ring true. Because at the same time, I admitted something else entirely. We were so physically attracted, just like Flint. It was an odd way of putting it, but it captured that spark between us. Quick, immediate, and impossible to ignore. There were other small tensions, too. At one point, he told me he thought I should dress more conservatively. I remember being taken aback. I told him it was the first time I'd ever had any complaints. It wasn't a serious argument, but it stayed with me. That evening, He acted a little differently. "So silly," I wrote, though I wasn't entirely sure what to make of it. The day went on. Chapel, where a man from Russia spoke and showed pictures, the usual routines, but my thoughts kept returning to the same contradiction. We had said one thing, but everything about us said something else. Tuesday followed a familiar pattern on the surface. Dean and I sat together in classes all day, something that had become second nature by then. But there was a small shift, something I noticed right away. He had received another letter from Rosie, and this time, for the first time, he wouldn't let me read it. That stayed with me. We went out to play tennis for a while, though the cold made it less enjoyable than usual. Even so, we stayed out there for a bit, talking as much as playing, as we often did. By evening, we ended up in the library, but only briefly. It didn't hold our attention long. Back in the dorm, I washed my hair, settling into the ordinary routines of the day. My dad had also brought my formal over, another small reminder of life outside of school, and yet it was the quieter moments with Dean that stood out most. After tennis, we had gone into the music room for a few minutes, and there, away from everyone else, he kissed me, just once. I remember thinking how much I enjoyed even that small moment. "Yummy," I wrote, which, in its own way, said everything. By then, I wasn't trying to pretend otherwise. It's just simply lush to kiss that boy. Even with everything else going on, the letters, the uncertainty, I kept coming back to the same thing. Being with him felt good. Wednesday felt easier again. I had early morning duty, which I found I actually enjoyed. There was something about getting started early that seemed to settle the day. Classes followed as usual, including Romans, and the routine felt steady for a change. There was also good news. Darlene Scheller had a baby boy, something that felt worth noting in the middle of everything else going on. Later, I spent some time writing letters, another familiar part of life that seemed to anchor the day. That afternoon brought a little more excitement. Dean had borrowed Elmer's car, and the three of us, Dean, Margie, and I, went downtown for a while. From there, we went over to my house to pick up a nightstand, along with my record player and some records. We weren't exactly supposed to be doing any of that. I noted it plainly, without permission. But we did it anyway. By the time we got back for supper, I was exhausted. The day had caught up with me all at once, and I didn't try to fight it. "So sleepy," I wrote, and before long, I had gone to bed early. It was a simple day, but one that felt full in its own quiet way. Thursday began a little differently. There were no classes that morning, as chapel extended through the entire time. What had begun as a normal service turned into something more, with people lingering as many experienced what we called a blessing, a deep, personal sense of God's presence. No one wanted to leave, and before long, the whole morning had passed. I saw Dean and found myself once again doing something small for him, fixing his wine-colored shirt. It had become one of those little ways I stayed connected to his everyday life. Then came something that felt much bigger. He asked me to the sophomore-senior banquet. I didn't try to hide my reaction. "Goody," I wrote, and I meant it. It felt like something special. Something official in a way that so much of what we had was not. By then, my feelings were no longer subtle. "I'm so fortunate to have Dean to run around with," I wrote, adding, "I'm just crazy about him." It was as plain as I could say it. And then even more so, he's simply perfection, my ideal plus. Looking back, it's hard not to smile at how completely I felt it. The rest of the day moved along more quietly. I spent some time in the library, and later in chapel, Sis Parker's brother spoke. I noted that he had all the humor in the family, which seemed to lighten the mood a bit. That evening, Margie and I kept things simple. eating pork and beans in our room and enjoying the small comfort of it. Fun, I wrote, and somehow it was. Even in the middle of everything else, those little moments still mattered. Friday felt ordinary, though not entirely at ease. Dean walked down with me after breakfast, one of those small, familiar moments that had become part of each day. I tried to settle in and study my Romans, but it didn't last long. Pearl came down, and before I knew it, we were talking instead. In class, I sat with Dean as usual, though by then I couldn't help wondering how long that would last. I wonder when they'll take that last privilege away from us, I wrote, half expecting it might happen at any time. After class, he went straight to work, and the day moved on without him. Margie, Pearl, and I went out on choir assignment, another part of school life that filled the time. Later, my mother called. Mary needed help at the bakery early the next morning, so they planned to come pick me up that night. Before I left, Dot and I drove down to see if Dean might still be at work, hoping to catch a few minutes with him. But we had just missed him. He had already gone. It was a small disappointment, but one that seemed to matter more than it should have. Even on a quiet day, I still found myself looking for him. Saturday was a long day from the start. I worked 10.5 hours at the bakery, and by the time evening came, I was already tired. But that didn't stop the day from continuing. Dean came over around 8:30, and we went downtown for a while before heading over to my Aunt Gertie and Uncle Frank's house. They were among the few who had a television set, and going there to watch was something of an occasion. We sat together and watched for a while, sharing in something that still felt new and a little out of the ordinary. We made it back home around 11:30, and like so many nights, it was hard to bring things to an end. I wrote simply that we ate and fooled around and left it at that. What I remember more clearly was how difficult it was to say goodnight. "It's so hard to go to bed with that boy there," I admitted, which said enough. There were lighter moments, too. I even put his hair up in pin curls, something that felt playful and easy between us. By then, I could see what was happening to me. "I think I like him more every day I'm with him," I wrote, and I knew it was true. I didn't try to soften the rest of it either. "He's such a mad lover. Oh, baby." It was late, around 3:30, by the time I finally went to bed. Somewhere in the middle of it all, we told each other that we loved each other. We laughed it off right away, saying we would forget it the next day. Just for fun, jokers. But even then, I think we both knew it wasn't entirely a joke. Sunday started a little awkwardly. Dean and I lingered over breakfast, enjoying being together a bit too much. And before we knew it, we were late to Sunday school. It only got worse when my dad came back to the house unexpectedly. I remember how embarrassed we both were. It felt, as I put it, real dumb. By then, I had a Sunday school class of my own to teach, another reminder that I was supposed to be responsible, even while everything else in my life felt anything but settled. The afternoon slowed down after that. The Wildmans came up for dinner, and afterward, Dean and I climbed up onto the roof, stretching out in the sun. We stayed there for hours, half talking, half dozing, trying to soak up a little warmth and rest at the same time. It was one of those quiet, easy stretches that seemed to pass without notice. That evening, we went to Angela's temple for church, and afterward stopped by the right spot before heading home. The day felt full, but not rushed, just one moment leading into the next. Through it all, we were rarely apart. I wrote that he kissed me so many times all day, and I didn't try to hide how I felt about it. I like the way he's always trying. It's good. Good. It was a simple way of saying something I was feeling more and more strongly. By the end of the day, I noticed even the small things. "I got a wee bit sunburned," I wrote, and how quickly it had all gone by. Weekends go so fast when I'm with him. That, more than anything, seemed to sum it up. Monday came quickly, and I felt it. "So sleepy, brother," I wrote. I hadn't even heard the alarm, and the whole day seemed to move in a fog. I went to classes, Romans, linguistics, English, but barely stayed awake through any of them. It was one of those days where everything felt just a little out of reach. In the afternoon, Margie and I took Dean to work, stretching out even that small bit of time together. Later, I went to Sears and bought him a shirt pattern and some blue material, another one of those small, practical ways I found myself thinking about him, doing something for him without even questioning it. That evening, most of the students were gone on choir assignment, which left things unusually quiet. My mom and Dot came by to pick up the car, and in passing, she mentioned that Enos had called me earlier that day. "Tough," I wrote, dismissing it just as quickly. By then, there wasn't much question where my attention was. I admitted it plainly. "I'm so crazy about Dean. I don't know what to do." And then, even more directly, "I'd just love to marry him someday." It was a bold thought, especially considering everything I already knew, that he wasn't serious, that things were uncertain, but I didn't hold it back. He's such a perfect angel. Looking back, it's hard not to see how completely I was caught up in it. Tuesday felt full again, though in a quieter way. Classes took up most of the day, but in the afternoon, Dean and I found time to meet and plan a few things for our Sunday school class. I was looking forward to it. "It's going to be so much fun," I wrote, and it felt good to be working together on something that mattered. Later, I went to Selma's room, where I measured the shirt pattern on him and cut it out. It was one more small, practical moment between us, something that felt both ordinary and personal at the same time. We sat and talked for a while after ancient history, stretching out the afternoon just a little longer. That evening, after supper, we decided to go for a walk, without purr. We both knew we weren't supposed to, which somehow made it more exciting. On the way back, we even had to climb over fences to get in again, something I noted simply as such fun. Somewhere along the way, he kissed me, and we lingered a little longer than we should have. He said he wished the weekends would come sooner, that they seemed to pass too quickly. I couldn't help but take that as a good sign. "That's a good sign," I wrote, holding on to it. Later, we went to the library together, returning again to the routine we always seemed to circle back to. But by then, I was feeling the effects of a lingering cold. "I've got such a cold," I wrote, which followed me through the rest of the evening. Even so, it didn't seem to matter much. Being with him still made everything feel a little easier. Wednesday moved along quietly. I spent some time sitting out in the sun, trying to study, though I'm not sure how much I actually accomplished. There were the usual small tasks, ironing, putting up crisscross curtains, which I noted with satisfaction. Looks good. Letters came too, one from Joyce Tinsley, and another from Bill Dancliffe's mother, small reminders of life beyond campus. I saw Dean in bits and pieces throughout the day, talking with him downstairs and again after classes. Even those short stretches seemed to matter, but I was still fighting a cold, and by evening it caught up with me. Dean went to a track meet, and I was so worn out that I went to bed early. Thursday was much the same, classes all day, and an attempt to keep up with everything else. In the afternoon, I went up to the sewing room to work on Dean's shirt, though the machine was so shot that it made the job harder than it should have been. That morning's American history test didn't help matters. I called it a stinker, though I thought I might have passed. By chapel, I had settled back into knitting again, letting the steady motion carry me through. It was one of those days where nothing stood out too much, and yet, even in the middle of it all, everything still seemed to revolve around the same quiet center. April began with a familiar frustration. After chapel, I was standing and talking with Dean when Brother Miller came up and told him to leave. It was abrupt and unnecessary, and I didn't try to hide how I felt about it. Dumbness, I wrote, summing it up in my own way. I tried to settle into studying that afternoon, but my attention wasn't really there. Before long, the day shifted in a much more interesting direction. Dot Coverley came by with a friend and picked me up, and we went to meet Dean at work. From there, we all headed up to Big Bear, to Dot's parents' place. The drive up was something else entirely. It was so foggy we could hardly see the road ahead, moving slowly and carefully the whole way, but even that didn't seem to matter much at the time. I remember writing that Dean kissed me all the way there, which, for me, was the part that stood out most. By the time we arrived, it was around 1:30 in the morning. There wasn't as much snow as there had been on our last trip, something I noticed right away, though it didn't take away from the feeling of being there again. It already felt like the start of another weekend that would pass far too quickly. Saturday began early. Dean and I were up before long, and after a good breakfast, we set out for the lake above Big Bear. It was everything I remembered and more. Gorgeous, I wrote, covered in snow, quiet and almost completely deserted. We wandered through the area, even climbing around some of the old, run-down cabins nearby, exploring without much purpose other than being there together. It felt like we had the whole place to ourselves. By early afternoon, we made our way back to the Coverleys, only to head right back out again, this time to rent a toboggan. We spent the rest of the afternoon going up and down the hill, laughing and enjoying it in that easy, carefree way that seemed to come so naturally when we were together. Until the last run. Somewhere on the way down, we lost control and slammed into a tree. Dean hurt his leg, enough to slow things down and remind us that not everything was quite as carefree as it felt. Even so, the day wasn't over. We headed home the long way, driving back through the Mojave Desert. About halfway there, something went wrong with the car. A rod gave out, and from that point on, we simply chugged the remaining 90 miles, hoping to make it back. By the time we finally arrived, it had been a full day in every sense. Later that night, we spent some quiet time together, winding down from everything. I wrote simply that we fooled around, and left it at that. We didn't get to bed until around 1:30, exhausted from the day. Somewhere along the way, we found ourselves talking, briefly, about marriage. Not about the two of us, not seriously, but about the idea of it in general. Still, it stayed with me. By the end of it all, I summed it up the only way that felt right. I like Dean more every weekend. Perfect day. Sunday brought us back to reality. We went to Sunday school and church as usual, and this time we taught our class together. It went well. We got along real swell, I wrote. And it felt good to share something like that, something a little more grounded than everything else that had been filling our time. Afterward, we had a chicken dinner, and for a little while, the day felt calm and ordinary again. But it didn't stay that way. By the time we returned to school that afternoon, word had already spread about our trip to Big Bear. It seemed like everyone knew. There was even talk that Sis Parker had gone up looking for us the day before, which only added to the feeling that we were being watched more closely than ever. I didn't hide how I felt about it. I'm so tired of gossiping kids at the school, I wrote, clearly frustrated. I tried to get some studying done in the typing room, but even that didn't last long. Sis Parker came down and told us to leave, another reminder that there didn't seem to be anywhere we could simply be left alone. So we left, We walked up to the right spot instead and sat down for a bowl of soup, making the best of it. Even there, the interruptions didn't quite stop. We kept running into Brother Robert's, which I summed up simply, so dumb. Still, in between it all, we found our moments. He kissed me a few times, and for a little while, everything else seemed to fade again. But it was getting harder to ignore. No matter where we went, it felt like someone was always watching. Monday felt heavy from the start. "So sleepy today?" I wrote, and I meant it. After the weekend, everything seemed harder to get through. We had our pictures taken in our formals for the high graph, something that should have felt more exciting, though I dismissed it in my usual way. It'll probably turn out Dumbo. I tried to work on my Romans theme a little, but my heart wasn't in it. I hate Mondays, I admitted, and part of that had to do with the simple fact that Dean was at work. I wanted him there. "I like him to be here all the time," I wrote, which said more than I probably realized at the time. What stayed with me most, though, was something from the night before. He had written me a note. "The cutest," I said, and in it, he told me he loved me. He had said it several times over the weekend, too, though always in the same way, light, almost joking, just for fun. I tried to accept it that way, but I couldn't quite. I wish he really meant it, though. It was a simple sentence, but it held everything. The rest of the day passed in the heat. Really hot, I noted, though that wasn't what I remembered most. It was that one thought that stayed with me. Not just what he said, but whether he meant it. Tuesday felt consumed by schoolwork. I spent much of the day preparing for a psychology test, which I later described simply as a stinker. Between that and my Romans theme, I felt buried in it all. "I'm just lost in the thing," I wrote, which was about as accurate as I could make it. Still, I found time with Dean where I could, talking before and after ancient history, and later meeting up in the library. We went over to the bookstore afterward, stretching out those moments together just a little longer. Even in the middle of everything else, my feelings hadn't changed. "He's such a big doll. I'm just crazy about him," I wrote, as though saying it again might somehow steady everything else. The rest of the day blurred together. Tests, studying, small details like seeing a picture about narcotics that caught my attention for a moment before everything else crowded back in. Wednesday felt even more focused, though not much easier. I worked on my Romans theme on and off throughout the day and finally finished it, starting to type it up at last. It was a relief, though it had taken more out of me than I expected. What stood out most, however, was how little I'd seen of Dean. "Haven't seen Dean hardly at all this week," I wrote, and I felt it. When we did manage to be together in the library, we made the most of it, sitting and joking for nearly an hour, enjoying even that small stretch of time. But the restrictions hadn't eased. That evening in the library, Sis Miller wouldn't even allow him to sit at the same table with me. It felt excessive, unnecessary, and I didn't soften my reaction. "She's a nasty old ick," I wrote, letting my frustration come through exactly as I felt it. Afterward, we went to the bookstore, finding a few more minutes together before the day came to a close. Even with everything working against it, we still kept finding ways to be together. Thursday felt like more of the same, but sharper. I went to classes with Dean, and for a little while, things felt normal. But that didn't last long. We were in the library after fourth period when Sis Miller came in and bawled us out again, making him move. It was becoming a pattern, one we couldn't seem to avoid. Even in class, it followed us. In ancient history, we had to sit apart because Brother Miller was there. I remember thinking, how childish they act. and I didn't try to hide how it made me feel. The rest of the day moved along in pieces. Pearl and I went downtown and sent cards to the children in our Sunday school class, something that felt simple and worthwhile in the middle of everything else. After chapel, I talked with Dean for a while, taking whatever time we could get. But there was more going on around us. Sis Parker had a long talk with Jewel about couples, which didn't leave much to the imagination. It was clear that what was happening between Dean and me was part of a larger concern. And then there was something else. Joanne Riel was leaving school, so she could work and marry Bud Bowles. I wrote it plainly. She's lucky. And then, even more honestly, I envy her. It was one of the first times I admitted that out loud. Later, Dean and I went to the bookstore for a short time, one more small moment together before the day ended. Even with everything pressing in, we still kept finding those moments. But I was beginning to see more clearly what I wanted, and what I didn't yet have. Friday moved along quietly. I went to Roman's as usual, and Dean left early for work, which made the day feel a little emptier than it might have otherwise. I kept busy where I could, working on a poster for the sophomore-senior banquet. Something simple, but at least it gave me something to focus on. After supper, I went home for the weekend. Pearl walked me up to the bus, one of those small, thoughtful moments that had become part of our routine. That evening, we had a birthday party at our house for the Wildmans, filling the night with family, conversation, and the familiar rhythm of being back home. Somewhere in the middle of it, I worked on Dean's blue shirt, sewing a little more on it, another quiet reminder of how much of my attention had shifted toward him, even when he wasn't there. It wasn't an eventful day, but it felt full in its own way. Saturday was simple on the surface, but it didn't stay that way. I spent most of the day sewing on Dean's shirt, working steadily at something that had become almost symbolic, caring for him in small, practical ways. In the afternoon, I went to the bakery as usual, keeping to the routine. But that evening changed everything. Dean came over around 8:30, and we settled into an easy night, playing records, talking, and spending time together the way we had so many times before. Then, somewhere in the middle of it, he said something different. This time, he told me he was in love with me, and he meant it. I knew the difference. He went on to say that he thought we were made for each other, and that if he weren't so young, he would ask me to marry him. I remember my reaction exactly. Jeepers. A mix of surprise and excitement, all at once. Looking back, I even joked to myself, my campaign is progressing. But underneath that, there was nothing uncertain about how I felt. By the end of the night, I wrote it as plainly as I could. I love him so very, very much. And more than that, there was something new. Something I hadn't had before. It was being returned. It's just like heaven to have your love returned. I believed it completely. We are made for each other. We agree on everything, I wrote, holding on to that certainty. And with it came a quiet hope that whatever he felt now would only grow stronger, because I already knew mine would. Sunday was one of those days that seemed perfect from beginning to end. It was a beautiful, hot day, and from the start, everything felt easy. I woke Dean up, we had breakfast, and went on with the morning, as we had begun to do together so often. We taught our Sunday school class, though 2 of the children were out with the mumps, and it felt good to share that responsibility. Later, we climbed up onto the roof again and stretched out in the sun, lingering there for nearly an hour. He kissed me over and over, and I didn't try to hide how it affected me. He leaves me weak, I wrote, which was the simplest way to say it. Back inside, we made 2 gallons of ice cream, turning the afternoon into something almost festive. After that, we drove over to the school to pick up the sophomore octet, who came out to sing at our little church for young people's meeting and the evening service. It turned into a full, happy gathering. After church, everyone came back to our house for food, and I remember how much everyone seemed to enjoy it. By the end of the night, we were riding back to school in the rumble seat, the air still warm, everything feeling just right. It was a wonderful day. Perfection, I wrote. And in that moment, I meant it completely. But underneath it, something else had begun to take hold. I didn't soften it at all. I want to marry Dean so bad. For the first time, it wasn't just a passing thought. It felt urgent, real, because there was something else looming. He wasn't planning to come back to school the next term. There was talk that he might have to go into the army. Oh no, I wrote, and I meant that too. The thought of losing him, of things changing before they had even really begun, felt unbearable. I think I'll die if I can't marry him this summer. I want to. Looking back, it's impossible not to feel the intensity of it all. Everything seemed perfect, and at the same time, it suddenly felt like it might not last. Monday began in confusion. Everything is such a mess, I wrote, and that's exactly how it felt. No one seemed to know whether we were going to Washington, when we would leave, or what the plans even were. It all felt uncertain and unsettled. But in the middle of it, the small things still stood out. I saw Dean, and I remember thinking how cute he looked that day. Even with everything else going on, that was what stayed with me. He told me he didn't want me to go to Washington, that we would both be too tired, and I didn't argue. In fact, I felt something closer to relief. I love him, I wrote, as though that alone explained it. By the time Margie, Pearl, and I went downtown later that day, the decision had more or less been made. We weren't going. And instead of disappointment, I felt lighter. I'm just as relieved, I admitted. We began making other plans. Going to the beach, spending time closer to home, things that felt easier, simpler. It will be fun, I wrote, and I believed it. The rest of the day settled back into familiar patterns. I worked on another poster for the sophomore-senior banquet, keeping busy in the middle of it all. It wasn't an important day in itself, but it showed something clearly. More and more, my decisions were beginning to revolve around him. Tuesday was full from beginning to end. Classes came first, as usual, but by dinner, there was something more to talk about. Sis Blossom announced her engagement, and not long after, Paul and Jewel did as well. It seemed like everyone around me was moving toward something permanent. I couldn't help but notice. That afternoon, Dean and I borrowed Elmer's car and drove out to Hanson Dam. The water was warm enough, and we went in without much hesitation. Afterward, we stretched out in the sun, talking and resting, letting the afternoon slow down around us. And then, almost naturally, the conversation turned. We talked about marriage, not just in passing this time, but seriously, whether we could get along, what love really meant, what it would take, and he told me again that he loved me. I didn't question it. I love him so very, very much, I wrote, and by then it felt certain. From there, we drove up to Poppy Peak, finding another quiet place to be alone. He kissed me a few times, and everything felt as it had been. Close, easy, right. We stopped by my house for dinner before heading back to school, carrying the feeling of the day with us, but it didn't last untouched. When we returned, Sis Parker came down and told me I shouldn't have gone out since I wasn't going to Washington after all. It felt unnecessary, and I didn't take it seriously. What a joker, I wrote, brushing it off in my own way. Still, the contrast was there. On one side, everything felt right, clear, even hopeful. On the other, the pressure hadn't gone away. But by then, I knew where my heart was. Wednesday was a hard day from the beginning. I had a linguistics test that I nearly failed. Practically flunked, I wrote, but that wasn't what stayed with me. By then, I already knew Dean was leaving that afternoon instead of the next day, and everything else seemed to fade behind that. After English, it caught up with me. I remember how suddenly it came. I just started crying. I hadn't planned to, but I couldn't seem to stop it. He wanted me to come down and say goodbye, but my eyes were so red, I couldn't bring myself to go right away. Instead, I sent him a note. Eventually, I found the courage. We walked down to the little lake near the school, a place that had become quietly familiar to us. There, in the middle of everything, we slowed down again. We noticed the simplest things. King-size goldfish, I wrote, and he picked a water lily and some wildflowers for me to wear in my hair. It was such a small, gentle moment. He kissed me a few times, and I didn't try to hold anything back. I already knew what I was feeling. I'm going to miss him so much. There wasn't anything more to say. Afterward, the day went on, though it felt different. Margie had a date, and I stayed behind, typing Dean's educational psychology term paper, another small way of staying connected to him, even as he was leaving. Later, I went home on the bus, the quiet settling in around me. I started reading The Robe, trying to fill the space with something else. My mom mentioned that Enos had come by to see me that night, but it barely registered. My thoughts were somewhere else entirely. Thursday began painfully. I went to the dentist in the morning for what was supposed to be a simple filling, but it didn't go as planned. The tooth broke, and before long, it had to be pulled instead. "Ouch," I wrote, which didn't begin to cover it. By the time I left, I felt kinda sick, and the rest of the day never quite recovered. Enos came by later, and we spent some time talking. He drove me around to Burbank, Glendale, and out to North Hollywood, looking for material for a dress and for Dean's shirt. It took a while, but we eventually found what I needed. Even so, there was no real confusion about where things stood. Margie came over that afternoon, and I settled into work, cutting out my dress and his shirt, and finishing the yellow argyle I had been making for him. It felt good to complete something, especially something meant for Dean. The movie pictures also came back, giving us something to look through for a while, another small moment tucked into the day. Enos asked me to go out that night. I said no. It wasn't difficult. Friday felt long and a little empty. Enos came by for a while, but the day never really took shape the way I had hoped. The weather turned too shot to go to the beach, which left us adjusting plans and filling the time as best we could. I kept busy. I worked on Dean's shirt, putting the finishing touches on something that had taken shape over several days. Then Margie and I went out to Glendale to find a pattern for her formal, and onto North Hollywood to pick out the material. By the time we got back, I had enough to begin my own dress, and with Mom's help, we even cut out Margie's. It was a full day in that sense. Productive, steady, filled with small accomplishments. But underneath it, something was missing. I said it simply, I wish Dean were here. And then, even more honestly, I miss that boy so much. By the end of the day, I found myself waiting for something small, but important. Hope I get a letter tomorrow. Saturday was productive, but not without its sting. I finished my dress and took it over to Aunt Martha's to have the buttonholes done. One more step in getting everything ready. My jaw was still bothering me from the dentist. My poor old jaw hurts, I wrote, and it lingered through the day. I went to work at the bakery as usual, moving through the routine. But what stayed with me most was the letter from Dean. It was short, too short. There was nothing in it of what I had been hoping for. No warmth, no sense that he missed me. I noticed it immediately. "Real cold," I wrote, and it felt that way. And then the reaction came just as quickly. "If his love cools off that fast, I don't want it." It was a strong statement, but it came from something real. Sunday brought something different. I went to Sunday school and church, and our class had 12 children that day. "Swell," I wrote, but even in the middle of it, I couldn't ignore the feeling underneath. Miss Dean so much. Later, Margie and I drove up to Ventura, where we had supper at Lois Gifford's and then went over to the Dancliffs. We looked at pictures and spent time talking, and before long, Bill came in. He was genuinely glad to see me. We went to church together, and I couldn't help noticing how strange it felt. Seemed so funny sitting beside him instead of Dean. It was a simple observation, but it said everything. Afterward, we went back to their house for hot chocolate and sandwiches. Bill was kind, attentive, and clearly pleased that I'd come. But even so, it wasn't the same. By the time we started home, I was exhausted. On the way back, my tooth began to bleed again and didn't stop. "Bled all night," I wrote, worn out in every way. It had been a full day, but in the middle of it, one thing remained clear. No matter who I was with, I was still thinking about him. Monday began badly. I woke up at 6 with my tooth just hemorrhaging, and it didn't stop until nearly 8:30. By then, I felt so sick, worn out before the day had even really started. I went straight to the dentist, and he was able to take care of it, though it left me drained. But then, something shifted. I received a letter from Dean. This one was different. He said he missed me. He wrote that he wasn't happy at home, that things were difficult with his mother, and that he felt it. I didn't try to hide my reaction, even from myself. "It's naughty of me," I wrote, knowing exactly what I was admitting. But I was glad. If things weren't easy for him there, it meant, in some small way, that he would come back to me. "I want him," I said plainly, even recognizing that his mother might try to come between us. The rest of the day moved along more quietly. I went over to Glendale and bought a black belt, a small errand that filled the afternoon. When I returned to school, the difference was noticeable. "It seems so quiet around here," I wrote. Without him, everything felt a little empty. That evening, I went to chapel and spent some time talking with Bill Feinstein and Herb Heller, passing the time as best I could. But even then, my thoughts kept circling back. The letter had changed things, and I held on to it. Tuesday changed everything again. I saw Dean after breakfast, and I didn't try to soften it. I've never been so glad to see anyone in my life. All the waiting, the wondering, the distance, it disappeared the moment he was there. We stayed close all day. In psychology and American history, we hardly paid attention to anything else, talking and passing notes back and forth as though we had been apart much longer than we had. I told him about Ventura, and I could see the reaction immediately. He was jealous. I noted it simply. Good. It meant something to me. Later, I gave him the things I'd been working on, his shirt and the socks. They felt like more than just gifts, little pieces of time and thought I'd put into something just for him. At one point, in the typing room of all places, he kissed me. Quickly, quietly. Even that was enough. "Just weak that boy leaves me," I wrote, and it was true. We ate supper together and found a few more minutes afterward to talk. And in those moments, he said it again. He still loved me. He had missed me. This time, I believed it completely. Then he said something more. He wanted me to come up to San Francisco after school was out to visit him, and he promised that he would come back with me for the summer. It felt like a promise of something ahead, something we could hold on to. By the end of the night, I couldn't concentrate on anything else. I couldn't even study, I wrote. I just think of him. So precious. And that was all there was to it. Wednesday felt full in the best way. Dean got up early and came to breakfast with me and even stayed to help with my duty. In the middle of it all, he managed to steal a few moments. Kissed me about 3 times, I wrote, as though that were simply part of the routine now. The day moved along easily. I worked on a poster, enjoyed the warm weather, a needy day, and found small ways to fill the time. At one point, I even wrote Margie and Mel's names on the little turtle out in the courtyard, something silly that felt like more fun than it should have been. There were errands too. I went downtown with Mel, and later Dean met me down at the laundry, where once again we found a few quiet moments together. 6 times, I noted, as though even that could be counted. Everywhere we went, we seemed to circle back to each other. Someone, Ward Williams, offered us a bit of advice about marriage, which I took note of, though I wasn't sure how much of it we really absorbed. That evening, a group of us went up to the right spot, Fran, Iris, Jean, Joyce, and Gladys, and before long, Dean joined us there. But even that simple outing turned complicated. Arlene was there, and she had a reputation for reporting things back. A stool pigeon, I wrote. So Dean and I had to stay outside for a while. Imogene even brought us out a piece of chicken, which I thought was so funny, the whole situation feeling a little ridiculous. Eventually, Arlene left, and we were able to go inside and eat like everyone else. By then, we were back to talking about what mattered most. We talked about summer, about what might happen when school was over. I found myself trying to convince him to stay at our house. "We'd have such a wonderful time," I said, and I meant it. "Oh, I hope he will." And before the night was over, he said it again. He loved me. Thursday held everything at once. There were the usual pieces of the day, classes, a PE test on scriptures, and time with Dean in between. But what stood out most was how closely we stayed connected. I even helped him work on his debate speech, something that felt like another way of sharing in his world. But then Rosie appeared again. He received a letter from her and let me read it. She wrote that she didn't want him giving me the same heartaches he had given her. It stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. "Well, I got sad about it," I wrote, and that was enough to say. Later, we went down to type his speech, and there, away from everything else, we had a long talk. I needed reassurance, and he gave it. He told me again that he loved me, that Rosie didn't matter to him, and then he kissed me. It wasn't casual or quick. There was something deeper in it, something that left me unsteady. I could hardly stand up, I wrote, trying to capture what I felt in the moment. For a while, that was enough. We wore our matching plaid shirts to supper and chapel, drawing compliments and enjoying the small feeling of being seen together. It was a beautiful hot day, and for a time, everything seemed to settle again. But it didn't last. After the debate, his side losing, he walked me back to the dorm, and there, the trouble returned. Rosie had sent another letter, this time through Ed Bradshaw. It brought everything back again. I felt it immediately, and before long, we were caught in another disagreement. I didn't try to excuse it. "They're all my fault," I wrote, knowing where it was coming from. I was jealous, because I loved him so very much. That night, I went back to my room and cried. Friday felt gentler. Dean came down to the practice room and found me there, and in the middle of everything else, we stole a few quiet moments together. He kissed me a couple of times, I wrote, as though it had already become part of the rhythm of our days. There was something else, too. He told me he hadn't gone back to read Rosie's letter the night before. He said he didn't think I would want him to. "He's so sweet," I wrote, and I meant it. Later, I went downtown to Sears and had lunch with him up on the roof where he worked. It gave us time to talk, really talk, without interruptions. And what he said stayed with me. He told me about his home, how his parents fought a great deal, and I began to understand something I hadn't fully seen before. I wrote that I thought, that's why he's afraid of an unhappy marriage. It explained things, not everything, but something important. When it was time to go, he walked me to the back stairs and kissed me goodbye. "Real cute-like," I said, holding on to even that small moment. It wasn't an eventful day, but it felt like I understood him a little better. Saturday began with another trip to the dentist. He filled a tooth. Ouch. Which didn't exactly set the tone for the day. That evening, Dean came over around 8, and before long, we were caught up in the ordinary things, helping move the deep freeze out to the alley, then heading over to Esther and Leo's to look at their wedding picture proofs. It was simple, familiar, and easy. Back at home, we looked at some movie pictures of Dean, laughing and lingering over them, stretching out the evening as long as we could. Later, we settled into one of those long, quiet stretches together. I wrote that we necked till around 3 and left it at that, but what stayed with me most was the conversation that came with it. We talked about marriage again, not just lightly this time, but seriously. What it would mean, whether we were ready, whether what we felt would last. I didn't try to hide my own feelings. "I want to marry him so bad," I wrote, and I knew it was true. We both said we loved each other, so very much. And yet, there was caution in it too. We decided that we would wait and see how we felt after spending the summer together, giving ourselves time instead of rushing ahead. Even then, I could sense something in him, a hesitation I didn't fully share. He said he was afraid that I might be in love with love itself, rather than with him. I didn't believe that for a moment. "But I'm not," I wrote. "I love him so very much." And at that point, I didn't question it at all. Sunday moved more quietly, though it still felt full. We went to Sunday school as usual, and this time there were 11 children in our class. "I enjoy it so much," I wrote, and I meant it. There was something steady and satisfying in it, something that felt good in a different way than everything else. In church, a little girl sat between Dean and me, which I noted simply cute. It was one of those small moments that stayed with me. Back at home, I made tacos. "Good," I wrote, and the day went on with that same easy rhythm. That evening, the sophomore octet sang at the South Pasadena Baptist Church. We were there by 8:30, though I was so tired by then that I could hardly stay awake. "I just slept through it practically," I admitted. Afterward, we went to the right spot for lemonade, stretching out the last part of the evening together. And then, just like that, it was over. "Weekends go so fast," I wrote, feeling it again. I said goodbye to him, kissed my lil boy goodbye, with Margie and Mel nearby, everything feeling both normal and not nearly long enough. After that, Margie and I went back to my house for the night. Another weekend had passed, and it never seemed like enough time. Monday felt slow and a little empty. Margie and I made it back to school in time for chapel, easing back into the routine after the weekend. I worked on another poster for the sophomore-senior sign-up sheet, keeping busy where I could. Dean went to work, and the day felt longer because of it. "I don't like Monday very well," I wrote, and that was enough explanation. That evening, I went to missionary prayers, but I didn't have much energy left. I admitted it plainly. I was such a deadbeat. I didn't even try to study and went straight to bed. Tuesday felt different. Dean got up and came to breakfast with me, and from there the day seemed to fall back into place. We went down to the practice rooms, and he kissed me a couple of times. Small moments that meant more than they should have. "I love that boy," I wrote without hesitation. There was still school to get through, a personal evangelism test, classes, time in the library, but it all felt secondary. I ate supper with him, finding whatever time I could. Sis Parker gathered us for a talk, another reminder of the watchful atmosphere around us, though it didn't seem to change much. That evening, instead of studying, I worked on embroidering some pillowcases, letting the quiet, familiar motion carry me along. Dean had gotten a haircut, and I noticed it right away. "He looks so little boyish now," I wrote, and I couldn't help but smile at it. I'm really crazy about that kid. And that, more than anything else, seemed to sum up the day. Wednesday began the way so many of them had started. Dean got up for breakfast, and afterward, we went down to the practice rooms, finding a few quiet moments together. "He kissed me a couple of times," I wrote, as though it had simply become part of the morning. There were visitors on campus that day, a group from Berean Bible School in San Diego, which added a little activity to the usual routine. But for most of the afternoon, Dean was gone, and I tried to turn my attention to a PE report that needed finishing. It didn't go especially well. By supper, I saw him again, though I remember feeling a little out of sorts. "Kinda disgusting with him," I wrote without much explanation. It was one of those moods that came and went without much reason. There were letters, too. From my folks, from Alma and Marie, small reminders of everything beyond school. The evening settled into its usual pattern. I went to the library, worked on another poster for the senior sign-up, and tried to stay focused. But what I remember most came later. We met at the store around 9:30 and ended up talking for a long time, letting the hours slip by unnoticed. "We talked for ages," I wrote. In those moments, everything felt simple again. He's such fun. And then, almost as if I were seeing it for the first time, I wrote something that surprised even me. "I can't really realize that I'm going with him. Jeeps, steady." It was something I had dreamed about, something that suddenly felt real. And before the night was over, he said it again. He loved me. Oh! Thursday felt full and a little restless. I started early, finishing my duty and working on the poster. Then later we put on a little skit in chapel to promote tickets for the sophomore-senior banquet. It added a bit of fun to the day, something different from the usual routine. Dean met me for an early lunch, and afterward I went down to watch him practice, staying close whenever I could. After history, we slipped away and walked down to the pond together, finding a little space of our own again. There, he kissed me. About 5 times, I wrote, and I didn't try to soften how I felt about it. I love that boy so much, I can hardly stand it. We wandered a bit farther, out across the pasture, though we weren't entirely alone. Little David Harrison tagged along part of the way. And then, just as quickly, we ran into Sis Beck. Oh, trouble, I noted, knowing exactly what that meant. That evening was the Athletic Association banquet. I sat beside Dean, and for a while everything felt easy again. Steak, ice cream, conversation, the simple pleasure of being together in a setting where it was allowed. Roy McEwen spoke during dinner, though I don't remember much of what he said. My attention was elsewhere. Afterward, Dean walked me back to the dorm. There were groups of couples gathered outside. About 10, I wrote, and with Sis Parker gone for the evening, the whole place seemed to loosen. Spring fever plus? No one wanted to go in, and I understood it completely. It's so hard to even leave Dean at night. I just want to be with him constantly. That feeling stayed with me, even as the night went on and others made plans, like going frog hunting of all things. It didn't matter what we were doing. I just didn't want to leave him. Friday moved more quietly. I went to the library in the morning to work on our Sunday school lesson, then on to Romans, keeping to the usual routine. Dean and I ate an early lunch together, and I rode downtown with him, stretching out that time as much as I could. Afterward, I returned to the library, trying to stay focused, though it never quite came easily. By afternoon, I headed home on the bus, settling back into the familiar rhythm there, washing my hair, getting ready for the evening. Most of the night was spent working. I typed on my PE theme, staying with it until I was worn out. So tired, I wrote, and I felt it, but even at the end of a long day, he was still there. Dean called around 9:30, and somehow that was enough to carry me through it. Saturday carried a little of everything. There was unexpected news first. Mary and Judy had sold the bakery, which meant I might be out of a job. It was the kind of change that should have mattered more than it did in the moment, but it was quickly folded into everything else going on. I worked my usual shift anyway, from 12 to 6:30, keeping the routine for as long as it lasted. That evening, I went with my parents to the Ice Capatis at the Pan Pacific. We had wonderful seats, and I remember thinking how good it all was. Something different, something special. We didn't get home until midnight. Afterward, the night took on its usual shape. I wrote simply that we ate and necked for a while, but what stayed with me was what followed. We had one of our little disagreements again, and I didn't try to shift the blame. "They're always my fault," I wrote, believing that I was the one misunderstanding, the one taking things the wrong way. And once again, the conversation turned to marriage. It felt familiar by now, the same questions, the same hesitation. He was still afraid that we might end up unhappy, and I couldn't quite convince him otherwise. But we didn't leave it there. At some point, we stopped talking and prayed together. That changed the tone of everything. It didn't solve the questions, but it brought us back to something deeper, something that held us together even when we didn't have answers. By the time we went to bed, it was nearly 4:30, just daylight beginning to show. And through it all, I knew one thing clearly. I love him so much that I'd go through anything for him. May began much like the weeks before, full and a little exhausting. Sunday school was lively. 14 in the class, I wrote, though they were really rowdy that morning. Still, I enjoyed it, even when it took a little extra patience. The rest of the day moved along in pieces. We had a good lunch, and then Dean slept most of the afternoon while I practiced, each of us keeping to our own rhythm for a while. By evening, we were back at school. Dean and the sophomore octet had to sing at an assembly in Whittier, and afterward we went out double dating with Vernon and Maxine. I was already worn out by then. So sleepy, I admitted, but the night continued anyway. On the way back, we found our usual moments together. I wrote simply that we necked on the way home, leaving the rest unsaid. Later, we sat out in front of the school and talked. Really talked. Once again, the conversation turned to marriage. We talked about what it would take, about adjusting to each other, about emotional stability, about whether we could make it work. It wasn't just dreaming anymore. It felt like something we were trying to understand, to figure out. And through it all, my feelings didn't waver. I love that little stinker so much, I wrote, smiling even as I said it. In my mind, there wasn't any real question. We'd be very happy, I know. All that remained was convincing him. Monday moved along quietly. I slept in a little till about 8, and went on to Romans, easing into the day. Much of my time was spent doing small, practical things for Dean, ironing the new shirt I had made for him, along with a few handkerchiefs. It had become second nature, taking care of those little details. Pearl and I spent the afternoon working on another sophomore-senior banquet poster, filling the hours while Dean was at work. Later, he came down to the laundry, and we talked for a while, picking up right where we always seemed to. This time, we talked about going to San Francisco after school was out, something that felt more real each time we mentioned it. When he left, he kissed me goodbye. "Sweet," I wrote, and that was enough. That evening, Mary and I went to the right spot. Good food for a change. Yum. A simple way to end the day. Tuesday felt fuller. Classes took most of the morning, and I noted that Darlene Scheller had a baby girl a month earlier, another small thread of life continuing around us. In the afternoon, I spent hours typing Dean's term paper, sitting in the typing room with him beside me. At one point, he had his arm around me and kissed me, as naturally as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Until it wasn't. We glanced out the window and saw Pooker. It about scared me to death, I wrote, the sudden reminder that we were never quite as alone as we thought. After supper, he came to find me again, this time with a box of chocolates, carefully wrapped, with a small thank you card tucked inside. It caught me completely off guard. It was so sweet. We went to the library afterward, settling into the familiar rhythm of the evening. And when it was time to say goodnight, I didn't hesitate. I kissed him right there on the steps. Later, back in the room, there were a group of us sitting around telling stories. 8 of us in all, laughing about things like peeping Toms, letting the day wind down in that easy, shared way. But even then, one thing stood out above everything else. The way he had looked at me, the way he had thought of me, and how much that meant. Wednesday had an easy, almost playful feel to it. I had an early breakfast with Margie, then went on to Romans and English, settling into the usual routine. Later, I ate supper early with Dean, finding those small pockets of time together whenever I could. That evening, a group of us, 4 of the girls, walked up to the right spot. It turned into a longer outing than we planned, and we didn't make it back until 7:30, catching a ride back with Bill Mackenzie. Afterward, I met Dean in the library, and before long, we were up to something else entirely. We had planned to scare Eleanor Greenwell, though it never quite worked out. She had to work, and the whole scheme fell apart before it started. We ended up meeting again in the bookstore instead, and that's where the evening took its turn. Somehow, in the middle of everything, I managed to spill milk all over him. I remember the moment clearly, surprised, a little embarrassed, but his reaction said more than anything else. He just laughed it off and said he still loved me, and somehow, that made it funny instead of anything else. Thursday began with mischief. While Dean was at practice, Margie and Naomi came up with the idea of making a dummy, propped up on a pole, and holding it in front of Rick and Eleanor's window to scare them. It sounded funny at the time, and for a moment, it worked. A little too well. They were so frightened they called Beck, and before we knew it, she was running up the stairs toward us. We saw her coming and bolted, ducking into the restroom, trying to hide. Of course, she followed us right in. So funny, I wrote, though it didn't feel quite so funny in the moment. In the end, there wasn't much we could do but go downstairs and apologize. She told us we'd better report it to Sis Parker the next day, which I summed up with just the right amount of sarcasm. What fun! But the day didn't stay light. Later, I learned that Dean had lost his job. Oh dear, I wrote, and this time, there wasn't anything funny about it. Friday began simply enough. We followed through on what we'd been told to do and went to see Sis Parker about the prank. To my surprise, she wasn't nearly as upset as we had expected, which took some of the edge off the whole thing. After Romans, the day shifted quickly. Dean, Orville, Stan, and I decided to go out to Hansen Dam. It was so hot, perfect weather for it, and before long it turned into something much bigger than we had planned. By the time we got there, it seemed like half the school had the same idea. Big swim party, I wrote, and that's exactly what it was. The water was good, the afternoon stretched out easily, and everything felt light again. But it didn't stay that way. Dean came over that night, and we found ourselves talking, as we so often did, long, quiet conversations that seemed to drift into something deeper without warning. And then, in the middle of it, he asked me to marry him, just like that. I didn't hesitate. I said I would. Even writing it later, I could feel how sudden it had been, how quickly everything had moved. I admitted it honestly. It's really kind of fouled up, though. I'm kind of mixed up. But even in the middle of that confusion, there was one thing I didn't question. I only know that I'm very much in love with him. And beyond that, I never could marry anyone else now. Ever. Saturday didn't go as easily as I would have liked. I worked my shift at the bakery, and Dean came down to have lunch with me, which helped break up the day. After work, we went to Glendale to get him a belt, something simple that turned into more time together. But it didn't stay simple. We drove out and parked in the Berman Hills, and somewhere along the way, the conversation shifted. It wasn't exactly a fight, but it felt close enough. We had a big argument, I wrote, and even trying to soften it didn't change how much it affected me. It about broke my heart. I could see it clearly. We were both struggling to sort things out. We're both mixed up, I admitted, knowing it wasn't just one of us. On the way home, the car broke down, adding one more layer to the night. Some man stopped to help and pushed us, and eventually we made it back. We weren't finished, though. Out on the back porch, we kept talking, working through it until things began to settle again. By the end of it, we had got things straightened out, at least for the moment, but the difference between us was still there. I want to get married real soon, I wrote, and he's a little afraid, I think. Sunday felt heavy from the start. I felt real horrible this morning, I wrote, carrying over the weight from the night before. Even so, the day moved forward. Sunday school went better this time, and I took a small moment to do something thoughtful, buying my mother a gardenia for Mother's Day. In the afternoon, we rested, trying to recover a little, though my mind didn't seem to settle. I tried to work on senior prophecies, but it didn't hold my attention long. We went to Macy's to look for a black formal and jacket, another small errand that filled the time. Then to the Wild Man's Church, and later back home again before returning to school. It was a full day, but underneath it, something had shifted. I wish my future were a little more settled, I wrote, and then, even more plainly, everything is kind of a mess now. Monday felt different again. Our duties had changed, and I was now waiting tables, which meant Dean and I didn't have that usual time together at breakfast. It was a small thing, but I noticed it. Most of the day was spent working for him in another way. I typed his Romans theme, staying with it nearly all day. It had become natural by then, doing whatever I could to help him. After supper, I helped Isabel with the children's play, putting makeup on the kids for practice. Dean had his own practice to attend, so I stayed there, waiting until we could find a little time together again. Eventually, we did. We sat in the back and talked, quietly, away from everything else. And this time, the conversation moved beyond if and into when. We decided on a wedding, late June or possibly late August. Just like that. I wrote it down, but even as I did, it didn't feel quite real. He asked if I wanted my ring before school was out. That made it feel even closer, more definite, more immediate, and yet I couldn't quite take it in. "Everything seems so unreal," I wrote. "I can't actually believe this is happening to me." Tuesday settled back into the ordinary. I went to classes as usual, and in the afternoon we turned our attention to the room, cleaning it thoroughly and even staining the floor. It was one of those practical, all-afternoon jobs that left everything looking better when it was done. That evening, the missionary play was performed for the student body. I helped behind the scenes, putting makeup on the performers, staying busy in the background while everything came together. Dean was involved too, singing backstage with the chorus. Even then, we found our way back to each other. I sat in the back and talked with him when I could, slipping into those small moments that seemed to matter more than anything else. It wasn't a big day, but even in the middle of everything going on around us, we were still finding ways to be together. Wednesday had a different kind of energy. It was missionary day, and classes were cut in half, which changed the whole rhythm of things. Much of the time was spent watching the booths go up, each one representing a different place. China's booth stood out and took first prize. "Real good," I wrote, impressed with how it all came together. That evening, the play was performed again, and this time, my folks came over to see it. I stayed busy backstage, putting makeup on the children and helping where I could, moving from one small task to the next. Somewhere in the middle of it all, I slipped over to the boys' dorm and saw Dean's room for the first time. It felt like stepping into another part of his life, something small, but somehow meaningful. During the play, we found a few minutes to talk, and later, down by the laundry, he kissed me. Just once, quick and quiet, but enough to stay with me. My parents had brought food with them, and afterward Margie and I sat together and ate strawberry shortcake. "Yummy," I wrote, enjoying the simple sweetness of it. It was a full day, busy, cheerful, and a little different from the usual, but even in the middle of everything else, he was still the part I noticed most. Thursday was the banquet. The day itself felt like preparation from the start. I went to classes, though I slipped out of phonemics and ancient history to get ready. There was too much to do. I worked on Pearl's formal, fixed my hair, and got everything together for the evening. When it was time, everything felt official. They had a microphone and announced each of us, and the fellows came to meet us. My corsage was 2 beautiful gardenias, and I remember how special that felt. Dean looked so cute, I wrote, and he did. The banquet was held at the Altadena Town and Country Club, and for a while everything seemed just right, dressed up, together, part of something important. And then, suddenly, it wasn't. I realized that I had started my period, and that it had shown on my formal. For a moment, everything stopped. I told Dean and hurried to the restroom, trying to figure out what to do. Somehow, I managed to pin it so nothing showed, doing the best I could with what I had. And through it all, he was kind. Dean was so sweet about it, I wrote, and that stayed with me more than anything else in that moment. After the banquet, the night opened up again. A whole group of us, about a dozen cars from school, drove up to Mount Wilson. We got out and walked over toward the planetarium, the air cool and clear. It was beautiful. There was a full moon, and everything seemed lit just enough to make it feel unreal. We walked, talked, laughed, stretching the night out as long as we could. "So much fun," I wrote. I got a little carsick on the way, but it didn't seem to matter. Dean stayed close, kissing me now and then, as though the rest of the world had faded away again. We were supposed to be back by midnight. Instead, we all ended up at the right spot, and by the time 11 of us girls finally made it in, it was nearly 2, Sis Parker was there waiting, and she was not pleased. Still, even that couldn't take away from it. We had the perfect evening. Friday carried the aftershock of the night before. "The campus is really buzzing," I wrote, and it was. Everyone was talking about how late we had come in, and there was a sense that something might come of it. I wonder what they'll do to us. Still, I didn't regret it. It was really worth it. Sis Parker came down and told me I was to remain on campus, but I already had a plan. I told her I couldn't. I had a dentist appointment and left anyway. It wasn't exactly following the rules, but by then, I was used to finding my way around them. Dean walked me out to the bus stop, and even in that small stretch of time, we turned again to the future. We talked about the kind of house we would have after we were married, what it might look like, how it might feel. It was becoming more than just an idea. At the dentist, I had 2 fillings done, one of them a front tooth. "Looks good," I noted, relieved that at least something had gone right. Afterward, I went down to Penny's and found some cute plaid, already thinking ahead. Before long, I had made Dean a shirt and a skirt for myself to match, another small way of tying our lives together. Later, I went over to Leota's and borrowed a book on sex. It was practical, in its own way. If we were really moving toward marriage, there were things I needed to understand. Saturday changed everything. I worked my shift at the bakery from 10 to 6:30, and afterward Dean came down to meet me. The evening started quietly. We sat together and read through the book I had borrowed, trying to understand things we both knew were becoming very real. "Enlightening," I wrote. But it didn't stay quiet. Before long, we were back in that familiar place, talking, holding each other, trying to make sense of what we were feeling. The conversation turned, as it had so many times before, to marriage. Only this time, it didn't feel distant. We both knew it. We couldn't wait until August. The words came quickly after that. We were in love, and more than that, we wanted to be together now, not months from now. So we decided, if we could arrange everything, we would be married right after school was out. Next month. I could hardly believe it, even as I wrote it. Jeeps, that's only 3 weeks. It was startling, and somehow thrilling at the same time. Sunday felt like stepping into something new. We taught our Sunday school class as usual, but the day was no longer ordinary. The afternoon was spent making wedding plans, real plans, not just talk, and still, it didn't quite feel real. "It's all like a dream," I wrote, a pretty heavenly one. We even began thinking about where it would happen, Magnolia Park Community, a place that already felt familiar and right. The rest of the day passed quietly. We went back to school, and while Margie left on a choir assignment, I went to bed early, worn out from everything that had suddenly changed. It was happening so fast. And yet, in my mind, it already felt certain. Monday came crashing down. What had felt so certain just the day before suddenly didn't seem so simple anymore. I called my mother that morning about finding a church, moving forward as though everything were already decided. But when Dean went to speak with Dr. Harrison about a June 4th wedding, the answer came back quickly and firmly. No. Just like that. I didn't try to hide how it hit me. I was brokenhearted, I wrote. I cried, unable to hold it back. Everything we had just decided felt as though it was slipping away. Billy and Gordon came over and sat with us, talking and praying until nearly 6 o'clock, trying to steady things. It helped, but it didn't change what had happened. I went to Sis Parker afterward to ask if I could go home for the evening. I'd made myself physically sick, but she refused. Even that door was closed. My mother came over later and brought some rings for us to look at, trying to keep things moving forward, but I was too upset to take it in the way I might have before. And then came the hardest part. Dean called his mother. Her answer was even stronger. She was very highly opposed. She said it was all too fast, too hasty, that we should wait until January. She told him to call her again in the morning. By then, there wasn't anything left to hold on to. I really was sick then, I wrote. That night, I didn't sleep. I just lay there and prayed. Tuesday began in the middle of the night. I woke up at 2 and couldn't go back to sleep. Everything from the day before was still pressing in, and there was no way to quiet it. By morning, I met Dean early, and almost immediately, we came to a decision. We would get married anyway. It felt bold, maybe reckless. But in that moment, it also felt necessary. We couldn't imagine stepping back. Dean called his mother again, hoping for something different. But nothing had changed. She said no, firmly, without hesitation, and we both felt it. We both felt sick then, I wrote, the weight of it settling in all over again. Still, we didn't let it stop us. We talked it through and came to another plan. If we couldn't do it here, we would go to Nevada and get married there. Even writing it, I knew how it sounded. Such a mess. Billy Johnson came up and talked with me for a long time, over an hour, trying to sort through it all. They were just as unsettled about it as we were, but in the middle of everything, one thought kept rising above the rest. Just so long as we stick together. That was what mattered. Even as everything else felt uncertain, we were already looking ahead, making plans for teaching jobs in North Dakota that fall, imagining what life might look like beyond all of this. And through all the confusion, one thing never wavered. I love him so very, very, very much. I believed completely that if we could just get through this, our marriage would be everything we hoped it could be. Wednesday felt quieter, but not without its moments. I started the morning waiting tables at breakfast, settling into the routine again. Somewhere in the middle of it, I received a small note from Dean's mother, thanking me for the Mother's Day card I had sent. It caught me a little off guard. I noted that it had been mailed Monday morning before the big excitement, which made it feel almost like it belonged to a different time, before everything had become so complicated. Classes followed, Romans, then an early lunch, and after that, Dean went off to a baseball game while Margie and I headed downtown for a while. It was one of those split afternoons where everyone seemed to be going in different directions. Later, Dean and I found our way back to each other. We went for a walk, something simple and familiar by now. He kissed me once, just once, but it was enough to stay with me. Around us, life on campus carried on in its usual, slightly ridiculous way. I remember noting that Stan Miller and Orville were giving Tony home permanence, one of those small details that made everything feel normal again, but the day wasn't finished yet. I had a talk with Sis Parker about Thursday night, the late return, the rules, everything that had been hanging over us. And this time, she surprised me. She was so sweet it just dripped off, I wrote, clearly not expecting it. Even more than that, she actually sympathized with me about Dean's mother. It was unexpected, and for a moment, it made everything feel just a little less heavy. Thursday began lightly, but it didn't stay that way. There was a senior breakfast that morning, bacon and eggs, a program, all of it meant to feel a little special. Dean and I sat together, quietly holding hands under the table, sharing something small and secret. More fun, I wrote. Classes followed, and for a little while the day seemed ordinary. But then everything shifted. Dean received a call from his sister, and letters from his brother, and from his mother. That one changed everything. I read it, and I didn't hold back my reaction. It was the nastiest letter I've ever read in my whole life. I wrote. She raved about losing him, about his father, about me. At one point, she even said she thought I was pregnant. It was horrible. It stayed with me, even as the day went on. That evening, Dean and I went to the right spot for supper, trying to put some distance between us and all of it. Afterward, we walked, longer than usual, nearly 2 hours, up toward Poppy Peak and beyond, just talking and talking. We needed to, because underneath everything, nothing felt settled anymore. Our marriage is still so uncertain, I wrote. Even so, when he kissed me, it brought me back to what I knew. I love him so much. The pressure from his family was there now, clear and unmistakable. They believed I was pushing him into this, that I was the one driving it forward, but I knew better. He wants to too, I wrote. I'm not the only eager beaver. By the end of it all, I was worn out, emotionally, physically. So tired, I said, and I went to bed at 8. It had been a long day, and a hard one. Friday felt full from the start, but there was an undercurrent running through it all. The morning was taken up with preparations for a senior tea. Margie, Dolores, and I spent hours making sandwiches, working steadily through it until my mother came to pick us up around 12:30. From there, the day moved quickly. We went to the dentist, then to look at rings again. This time, I chose the one my mother had brought over earlier in the week, something that felt, at least for a moment, settled. Back at home, I cooked dinner, slipping into something familiar and steady before the evening picked up again. We went out to Los Angeles for a baseball game, SCBC versus BF, but it turned out to be so cold that it was hard to enjoy it for long. Afterward, we drove up to the Griffith Park Observatory and walked through it, taking in the views and the quiet spaces inside. By the time we got home, the night had softened again. We sat together, talking, holding on to the time we had. I wrote simply that we necked and talked till 12:30, but it was more than that. Once again, the conversation turned to marriage, only this time, with even more urgency. We decided to get married earlier, maybe. It felt like everything was pressing forward, faster than we could quite keep up with. And then, just as the day was ending, another piece of news came. My mother had received a letter from Mrs. Gilbert. Her words were clear enough. If Dean married, she'd be very nasty. It hung there, heavy and unresolved. Even as everything else seemed to be moving closer, there was still so much standing in the way. Saturday felt like everything was just a little off. I worked until 1, and Dean met me afterward. We went to pick up the rings, something that should have been simple, exciting even, but when we tried them on, they were too big. It hit me harder than it should have. We took them back, and the jeweler said they'd be ready by 4. But by then, I was already upset. I was so upset, I didn't go back to work till 3:30, I wrote, trying to steady myself enough to finish my shift. The rest of the afternoon didn't go much better. We went downtown and bought satin for our gowns, trying to move forward with plans. But then Dean forgot to pick up the rings again. That was enough to undo whatever calm I had managed. I was just sick, I wrote. From there, we drove to Pasadena to pick up a trumpet he had forgotten, one more errand in a day that already felt scattered and unsettled. Finally, my mother called the jeweler herself and arranged for the rings to be ready the next morning. By then, I was exhausted. So tired and worn out, I wrote, and I went straight to bed. Dean felt it too, though in a different way. He told me later that he had been looking forward to our Saturday night together, and I could tell I had hurt his feelings without meaning to. It had been one of those days where nothing quite came together the way it should have. Sunday, however, seemed to gather everything back up again. We went to Sunday school, and before I quite knew it, Brother Wildman announced our engagement. Just like that. It should have been a moment to take in, but even then, something small interrupted it. "My rings are too small. Such a deal," I wrote, as though even that detail couldn't quite stay settled. The day quickly filled up. We took our Sunday school class, 14 children in all, on a picnic spaghetti feed at Victory Park. "What a job," I said, managing all of them, feeding them, keeping everything together. It was work, but it was also fun in its own way. Afterward, we took them home, the day moving steadily forward. And through it all, my thoughts kept returning to the same place. "Our marriage is going to be so wonderful," I wrote. For the first time, I added something more grounded, more certain. "I really think I'll enjoy it now." That evening, we went to the Foursquare Church, where Dr. McKean announced our engagement again. "More fun," I said, taking it in a little more easily this time. There were revival meetings going on, too, with lively music and energy filling the place. By the time we got back to school, I wasn't feeling very well, worn out from the day. But even then, one thing stayed simple and clear. Monday felt long. "School. It's sure getting tiresome," I wrote, and by then, I meant it. The days were beginning to blur together, especially with so much else weighing on my mind. Most of the kids had gone on a choir trip down to San Diego, which left the campus quieter than usual. I tried to use the time to study, but it didn't come easily. Beulah came in and talked with me for a while, breaking up the afternoon. And later, Mel asked me for advice about Margie, another reminder of how everyone seemed to be caught up in their own little complications. The weather didn't help. "Hot," I noted, and it seemed to settle over everything, making it harder to focus, harder to think. After supper, Dean and I found time together again. We talked for a long while. For ages, I wrote, before going to the library, and then on to the bookstore, stretching out the evening the way we always did. "So thirsty," I added, as if even that small detail belonged to the day. Tuesday felt much the same, only more so. "Another hot day," I wrote, and the heat seemed to drain whatever energy I had left. Classes were tiring, and everything felt just a little harder to get through. We received our annuals that day, and Dean and I bought one together, something small, but meaningful. A shared piece of the year we were already beginning to leave behind. Margie and I went downtown afterward. I picked up a few things, panties, slips, and looked for a dress, but nothing felt right. By then, I was worn down. "I'm so tired," I wrote, and it showed. We had our linguistics final the next day, but I couldn't seem to make myself study. "I can't concentrate long enough," I admitted, even knowing how important it was. Still, I ended up back in the same place, the bookstore, with Dean, because no matter how tired I was, that was where I wanted to be. Wednesday brought more uncertainty. Dean received a letter from his mother saying she would be coming down that weekend, Saturday. "Oh dear, more complications," I wrote, as if things weren't already tangled enough. We tried to talk it through, once again circling the same question, whether we should wait a week or not. Nothing felt settled, and every new development seemed to push things in a different direction. And then there was more. All the fellows had been campused for a week because of the banquet, the late night, the broken rules, and that only made everything harder. It meant less freedom, fewer chances to be together, more pressure on everything already in motion. Still, the day went on. I went downtown and bought shoes, a purse, hose, and material for a sunback dress, continuing to prepare even in the middle of all the uncertainty. It felt as though I was moving forward whether things were settled or not. Later, Dean and I met in the library, trying to focus, though it didn't come easily. I took my linguistics test, getting through it as best I could. my mind only partly on what I was doing. By evening, we were back at the bookstore, together. And even there, in the middle of everything, rules, worry, questions, he managed to make it feel light again. He kissed me right out in front of the bookstore. "What a joker," I wrote, half amused, half surprised. And somehow, in that small moment, everything felt simple again. Thursday brought more frustration. "Another big complication," I wrote, and it felt like one more thing on top of everything already unsettled. The boys had all been campused for the weekend because of Mount Wilson and the banquet, and just like that, our plans fell apart. No Yuma. Dentist appointment canceled. What a life! It felt like nothing could move forward without something else getting in the way. I couldn't just let the day pass like that, though. I drove over to school from home just to see Dean, needing that time together in the middle of everything. We went for a ride up toward Altadena, finding a quiet place to park. It was the kind of moment we had come to rely on, away from everyone else, where we could finally talk. And we did. We talked about everything that wasn't working, everything that kept getting in the way, everything that felt uncertain. "I wish things would straighten themselves out," I wrote, and I meant it, because underneath all of it, nothing had changed. I'm so very much in love with Dean. That was the one thing that still felt clear. By Friday, the pace slowed just a little. I stayed busy at home, sewing Dean's pajamas and finishing a sunback dress for myself. "It's really sharp," I wrote, pleased with how it turned out. Later, I went back over to school, and by then, something had shifted again. Dean decided to come home with me for the weekend. It felt simple, easy. On the way, we stopped in Glendale and played miniature golf, laughing and enjoying something light for a change. It was fun. By the time we got home, I was exhausted. "Awfully tired," I wrote, and we went to bed early. After a week of heat, confusion, and constant questions, it felt good just to be still. Saturday felt like waiting. The day itself was full of small, practical things. Going to the dentist, into town, picking up a few necessities. I bought a new bra, stopped at the grocery store, even cleaned the car, keeping busy, moving from one task to the next. But underneath it all, I was waiting. We were expecting Dean's mother. Instead, a telegram came. She wouldn't be arriving until the next day. Good, I wrote honestly. I'm not too anxious to meet her anyhow. Even that small delay felt like a kind of relief. We ate a late supper, and later I studied our Sunday school lesson, trying to settle my thoughts. But by the end of the day, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened, everything we had been through in such a short time. I never knew anything could be quite so wonderful as love, I wrote. And then, just as honestly, it's sure been lots of trouble, but it's worth it. Sunday brought the moment I had been half dreading. We went to Sunday school as usual, but Dean left afterward to meet his mother in Pasadena and bring her back. By the time she arrived for lunch, I was ready, or at least I thought I was. She made an impression immediately. "Very domineering," I wrote, not softening it at all. The afternoon stretched on, with my mother talking with her, and then all of us together. The conversation circled around the same concerns. Her concerns. She was firm, unyielding. "She's just stubborn," I wrote. "Says we have no security." I didn't try to pretend otherwise. "I don't like her at all." That much was clear. We went on to church at the temple, but even there, things didn't feel settled. Dr. Harrison came in and sat in the row in front of us, and with Dean already campused, it felt uncomfortable enough that we left and went on to Bethany in Alhambra instead. There, I met Dean's brother, Another new piece of his world opening up in the middle of everything else. By then, I was worn out. So tired in church, I almost went to sleep, I wrote. Back at home, we rearranged things so Mrs. Gilbert could have our bed, and I slept in the living room. Before turning in, I slipped out to the back porch to see Dean one more time. Even after the long day, the tension, the conversations, the uncertainty, that part remained unchanged. I've never been so entirely happy with a boy in my life. Monday was overwhelming. We went back to school, but everything felt overshadowed by the conversation that followed. I spent a long time talking with Mrs. Gilbert, and before it was over, I was in tears. I didn't soften it when I wrote it down. She is a devil. First class. She said things that stayed with me, real, horrible things, and made it very clear how strongly she opposed us. She even said that if we married, she would spend her last cent on having it annulled. It left me shaken. I was just sick, I wrote. And then there was more. She wanted Dean to come to Oakland for the summer and made him promise to come, at least for a week right after school was out. It felt like she was pulling him away from me. I despise her, I wrote, not trying to hide it. Dean and I spent the entire afternoon talking, trying to sort through everything, hundreds of them, it felt like. Problems, questions, decisions that didn't seem to have clear answers. And yet, even in the middle of it all, one thing remained unchanged. We are so in love. That was the part I held on to, but I could feel the tension inside myself, too. I'm so happy and unhappy at the same time, I wrote. Happy when I was with him, when he held me, when he made love to me in those quiet, familiar ways, and unhappy when everything else pressed in. By the end of the day, I was too exhausted to study. Tuesday felt steadier, at least on the surface. I studied hard for my Constitution final and managed a B, though I admitted I hadn't studied at all for ancient history. Dean and I played tennis that afternoon, something simple and easy, and later we walked down to the Duck Lake after supper. There, everything softened again. He was so sweet, I wrote, and I felt it. I realized something else, too, that my feelings weren't standing still. I just love him a little bit more every day. He kissed me a few times, and in that moment, everything else faded away. That boy is the only real happiness I have. Love him. Wednesday was consumed by studying. My Romans final was so hard, and I felt like I had nearly failed it. But the afternoon belonged to Dean. We sat out on the lawn for hours, talking, holding on to that time together. At one point, I read through all of his old letters from Rosie before he burned them. Something final about it, something that felt like closing a door. Pacoda and Jim Belmore came down and joined us for a while, but my thoughts kept circling back to the same concern. If Dean didn't find a job soon, he would have to go home. That hung over everything. We sat on the front steps later and talked some more, and in the practice room, he kissed me again. Small, familiar moments that meant more than anything else that day. I studied for my psychology test that night, though it was hard to keep my mind on it. Thursday felt scattered and restless. The psychology final was a stinker, and I was glad to be finished with it. After lunch, Dean took me downtown in Elmer's car, and we bought a few things. Slips for me, material for another shirt for him, continuing to prepare for a future that still felt uncertain. We waited while he got a haircut, passing the time together. That evening, a group of us walked to the right spot for Sundays, stretching out the day a little longer. But the night didn't stay quiet. There was a girls' party that felt, as I wrote, silly, so a few of us slipped away. Beulah, Eleanor, and I, and ended up sneaking around the boys' dorm, scratching on windows and climbing down fire escapes just to scare them. The whole place turned into chaos. This place was a madhouse. We watched from the windows, laughed at the confusion, and when someone put wet spaghetti in my bed, we answered in kind, moving it right along to someone else's. It was ridiculous, and it was fun. Friday brought things back into focus. I spent the morning talking with Pearl, and then at 11, my mother came to pick us up. From there, the day turned practical again. We stopped in a few places, helping Dean look for a job. We went to the unemployment office, following through on whatever we could. And finally, there was some good news. Dean was supposed to report Monday morning to a sheet metal shop in the valley. Good, I wrote, relieved. Now he won't have to go to Oakland next week. That one piece of news lifted a weight. We went back to school afterward and gathered up all of my things, bringing them home. Another step forward, another sign that things were changing. Saturday felt like a kind of release, though even that came with its own weariness. We went to the beach with the Wildmans and some others. Strangers, I wrote, though it didn't seem to matter much once we were there. The fellows went diving for abalone while we stayed on shore, and we all ate lunch together, letting the day unfold easily. It was simple. We both ended up a wee bit sunburned, and on the way home, we stopped at a drive-in, stretching out the last part of the day. Afterward, a hot shower felt especially good. Got my back scrubbed, I wrote, one of those small comforts that stayed with me. But by then, it was catching up with us. We're both so tired, kinda sick, I admitted. I didn't feel quite right, real bloated, I said, and the energy of the day began to fade. Even so, we kept talking about what came next. We spoke with Gertie about the possibility of renting her bunkhouse, something for Dean now, and maybe for both of us later. It was another step, another piece of the future we were trying to put together. From there, we went over to Pasadena to pick up Dean's trunk, finishing out the day with one more errand before finally slowing down. By night, I was completely worn out. So tired and sick. Sunday never really began. Dean woke me early, 6:30, I wrote, but I was already feeling worse. I am just sick, I said plainly. I didn't go to Sunday school or church. I didn't go to the bachelorette gathering either. Instead, I stayed in bed and slept, letting everything else fall away for a while. And through it all, Dean stayed with me. He's so sweet because I'm sick, I wrote. He was in my room constantly, checking on me, taking care of me, like a little old hen, I said, half amused, half touched. It meant more than I could quite put into words, but the day didn't stay completely peaceful. That evening, he picked up my diary and read it. And that changed things. He saw the parts about my past, about going out with other boys before him, and it hurt him more than I expected. He became quiet, then hurt and pouty, I wrote, and I could feel the shift between us. It wasn't anger exactly, more something deeper, something unsettled. So we stayed home that night too. No church, no going out, just the two of us, sitting with something neither of us had quite known how to handle. Monday began with something small, but it said a lot. Dean had started his new job, and when he came home, his fingers were all cut up from the work. It was rough, harder than either of us had imagined, and I remember how it felt to take care of him afterward. It was such fun fixing dinner, I wrote, as though even that simple thing held meaning. But the evening didn't stay easy. After supper, we sat down and had one of our long talks, the kind that seemed to come more often now. And somewhere in the middle of it, he said something that stopped me cold. He wasn't sure whether he loved me or not. Well, it about broke my heart. I wrote. I didn't hold anything back from myself. I love that guy more than life. We went to graduation that night, though we were late and left early. I couldn't focus on it. My mind was somewhere else entirely. By the end of the evening, we talked things through again, and somehow it all got kinda straightened out, but the fear lingered. I think I'd rather die than have him stop loving me. Tuesday felt softer. I went out to the valley looking for work, though it quickly became clear how difficult that was going to be. Jobs are really hard to find, I wrote, discouraged but still trying. That evening, Dean and I went to Pasadena and spent time with Margie and Pearl, meeting their folks and settling into something that felt almost like normal life. And that was the difference. It's just heavenly having Dean living here, I wrote. We had fallen into a rhythm, simple, steady things that felt more like a life together than anything we had known before. I tucked him in at night, woke him in the morning. We read the Bible together. We prayed. It's real nice. Even the small inconveniences became part of it. On the way home, we had trouble with the car, and he ended up pulling me the whole way. What a ride, I wrote, laughing at it afterward. Wednesday was quieter. I went to Hollywood to look for work again, putting in applications wherever I could, 3 or 4 places, hoping something would come through. Back at home, I cleaned my room, trying to keep things in order while everything else felt uncertain. And I took Dean, my baby, as I called him, to the doctor to have his fingers looked at. It was another small act of care, another piece of the life we were already building. Thursday felt full again. I spent part of the day sewing, working on material to match my sundress, making another shirt for Dean, continuing that pattern of creating things for him, for us. By then, our plans shifted again. We decided to go to Oakland together, and I made reservations for a Saturday morning flight. It felt sudden, but also inevitable. Everything seemed to move that way with us. That evening, we went out to Baldwin Park to hear the Weatherford Stomps Quartet. Leslie, one of Dean's friends, was singing. And it felt good to be there, to listen, to be part of something outside of ourselves for a little while. Good, I wrote simply. On the way home, I was so tired I slept almost the entire drive, but something had changed. I've grown to love Dean so much more these last few days, I wrote, and then more clearly. It's a deeper, richer love. Friday brought another turn. I packed my clothes and worked on a rayon-draped dress, trying to prepare for what we thought was coming next. At one point, the PA curtain factory called and offered me work, but I turned it down. Everything was already in motion. Or so I thought. Then things shifted again. Dean quit his job, and then his mother called. She said he couldn't go to work on Monday. Just like that, everything changed. We canceled our flight reservations and, almost in the same breath, made a new plan. If we could both get our jobs back, we would stay there for the summer. Another change. Another adjustment, everything still in motion. Saturday felt uncertain, like everything was hanging in the balance again. I went to the curtain factory, and this time, they told me to come in on Monday. At least something was settled for me. But for Dean, things didn't go the same way. He tried to get his job back and was turned down. Oh, that's bad, I wrote, and it was. We didn't seem to have the energy to do much after that. We just laid around all day, I said, as though even deciding what to do next felt like too much. Later, we went into town, and Dean worked on his car for a while, trying to keep something moving forward. Our plans shifted again, as they so often had. Instead of flying, we decided we might drive his car, if we go. Even that part wasn't certain anymore. That evening, we went for a ride, wandering through Glendale and Hollywood, not really going anywhere in particular, just being together. We stopped at the Brown Derby for a sundae, one small moment of normalcy in the middle of everything else. Maxine and Paul Cosby were around too, adding a bit of life to the day, but by the end of it, we were both completely worn out. "So tired," I wrote. That night, we tried to pray together, but exhaustion took over. We both fell asleep praying. It seemed to sum up everything: effort, intention, and simply not having anything left. And even then, Dean's mother called again. College Sunday brought the decision I had been dreading. We went to Sunday school and church, moving through the morning as though everything were normal. In the afternoon, I watched Maxine's baby for a while. "She's a sweet little thing," I wrote, holding on to something gentle in the middle of everything else, but nothing could hold back what was coming. Dean decided he was going to Oakland. Tomorrow. That was it. I didn't try to hide how it affected me. "I cried all afternoon," I wrote. "I hate to be a weeper, but I can't live without that boy." We went to Pasadena to pick up his mail, filling the time the best we could, and on the way home, we stopped at a drive-in. Just one more place, just one more moment together. Because we both knew what was coming. That night, I told him goodbye. And even as I wrote it, I understood something more clearly than I ever had before. I've never loved him so much or so completely as I did tonight. Monday was the beginning of something I hadn't been ready for. Saying goodbye to Dean that morning was harder than I had imagined. "I'll miss him so much," I wrote, and even that didn't seem to cover it. From there, I went straight to work, trying to step into something new, something that would fill the space he had left. But it didn't take long to realize how empty it felt. The work itself was simple. I just fold curtains or put papers in them or bands around them, I wrote, but it felt endless. So boring. The people didn't help. Everyone is so unfriendly, I said, and the hours dragged on, one after another. My feet hurt from standing, and by the end of the day, I was worn out. Still, there was one small comfort. On the way home, I met another girl who worked there and lived on Magnolia. That will be nice, I thought. At least something familiar in the middle of it all. But nothing replaced what was missing. I miss having my baby to kiss hello. That was the part I couldn't get used to. I wrote him a letter that night. Tuesday felt just as long. Work dragged again. "It's tiresome," I wrote, and time seemed to move more slowly than it should. It went a little faster than the day before, but not by much. I ate with Evelyn, which helped. "So it's not so lonely," I said, finding small ways to get through it, but there was no letter from Dean. That mattered more than anything else. "Maybe tomorrow, I hope." I wrote to him again that night, then went to bed early. Nothing to stay up for now at night. That said everything. And still, wish I could go up there this weekend. Well, Wednesday didn't get any easier. "Work again? What a horrid job," I wrote. But then something shifted. A letter came from Dean. And just like that, everything changed. "I just cried and cried when I got it," I wrote. "It was so sweet and precious, and it reached me in a way nothing else could." For a moment, I didn't care about anything else. For 2 cents, I'd quit my job here immediately. That was how strong the pull was. That night, I cried myself to sleep. Thursday brought a decision. Work went on, the same as before, but my mind was already somewhere else. I was going to see him, "I'm going to see Dean this weekend," I wrote, and that was enough to carry me through the day. It would take everything I had earned that week, but it didn't matter. I got to see him. Another letter came too. So sweet. And with it, a realization I hadn't fully understood until then. Never knew I could miss anyone so much. Friday felt endless. Work went twice as slow, I wrote, every minute stretching out as I waited for the day to end. Finally it did. Paul and Mackie picked me up and drove me as far as Bakersfield, getting me part of the way there. From there, I wired Dean and boarded the Santa Fe bus, beginning the rest of the journey alone. I rode all night. By the time I arrived in Oakland, it was 3:20 in the morning. And he was there, waiting for me. "Oh, baby," I wrote, the relief and joy of that moment spilling out all at once. "Love that boy." He had borrowed a convertible from a friend, and together we drove out to his house, arriving just as the morning was beginning, around 5:30. After everything, I was with him again. Saturday felt like a gift, even in its simplicity. We had breakfast together, and then, after everything it had taken just to get there, I slept for a while, finally letting myself rest. The day moved easily after that. We rode all over Oakland, seeing the city the way he knew it. "It's a pretty city," I wrote, though I noticed right away, kinda cold and windy. Still, it didn't matter. We were together. Later, we returned the car, and that evening we took the bus into San Francisco. The cold followed us there too. "Freezing cold," I said, but even that became part of the memory. We stayed out late, stretching the time as much as we could. By the end of it, I was exhausted. So sleepy. But even through that, one thing stood out above everything else. It's so good to be able to just kiss Dean again. That was enough. Sunday came too quickly. We went to Sunday school and church, moving through the morning with a quiet awareness that the weekend was already slipping away. Joyce Simpson and Imogene were there, familiar faces in a place that still felt a little distant from everything I knew. "This weekend has gone so fast," I wrote, and I felt it. "I hate to leave." There was another conversation with his mother. His ol' mother, I called her, and even then, that tension hadn't disappeared. But the day kept moving forward. Soon it was time to go. He took me to the airport, and we stood there together, trying to hold on to the last of the time we had. Before I left, we made a plan. He would come down the next weekend, and this time, he would bring me back with him. For good. Even that felt hard to believe. My flight didn't leave when it was supposed to. There were problems, delays, and I didn't get off the ground until 1 a.m. But once we were in the air, it felt almost peaceful. "Plane ride was fun," I wrote, as though even that small detail mattered. By the time I got home, it was 4:30. Another trip, another goodbye. But now, there was something ahead to hold on to. Monday came hard after the trip home from Oakland. I had traveled through the night, arrived home in the early morning hours, and then gone straight to work without really sleeping at all. By the time the day ended, I could feel the exhaustion in every part of me. "Boy, was I dead at work today," I wrote afterward. There wasn't much more to say. The whole day passed in a blur of fatigue, curtain factory routine, and trying to keep myself moving. Tuesday and Wednesday slipped by almost unnoticed. Work again. Work. The entries themselves seemed tired. By then, work had become something to endure rather than something to describe. The days felt suspended somehow, as if real life were waiting just ahead of me somewhere else. And in many ways, it was. By Thursday, I finally quit. I worked only until noon before leaving for good. there was too much left to do. Packing, sorting, preparing to leave everything familiar behind. Even the diary entry felt hurried. I had so much packing, etc. to do. I went to the doctor for a blood test that afternoon. One more practical detail in the middle of all the emotion and uncertainty swirling around us. But underneath all of it, I already knew my life was changing. Friday felt entirely different from the days before it. I spent most of the day packing, gathering clothes and personal things together, trying to prepare myself emotionally for what was coming. 2 letters came from Dean that day, and I clung to them while I waited for evening to come. Then, finally it did. I went to meet the 9 o'clock plane, and he was on it. "Oh, sweet baby," I wrote afterward. And even now, I can still hear the relief and excitement in those words. After days apart, simply seeing him again seemed to steady everything inside me. We stayed up late talking, kissing, holding each other, reluctant to waste a single minute of the little time we had left before the next great step in front of us. For months, we had talked endlessly about the future. Now it had suddenly arrived. Saturday became the dividing line between one life and another. Dean spent part of the day working on his car, getting it ready for the long drive north, while I packed the last of my belongings into it. At some point, the reality of what I was doing finally settled over me. I was leaving home, not for a trip, not for school, for marriage, for a new life. When the time came to say goodbye to my parents, I tried to make light of it in my diary. Well, Jean has finally grown up and left home. But beneath the cheerful words was something much larger. A 19-year-old girl stepping away from everything familiar because she believed love was worth the risk. We drove through the night, stopping only briefly to sleep for a couple of hours before continuing on again. The road stretched endlessly ahead of us, carrying us farther and farther from the life I had always known. By Sunday morning, we stopped for breakfast somewhere along the way, and then kept driving until noon. And finally, we arrived. After all the uncertainty, all the opposition, all the tears and plans and arguments and reconciliations, I had followed him north to begin our life together. Even then, nothing felt entirely simple. I already knew living near his mother would not be easy. "I'm going to hate even living near his mother," I admitted honestly. But by that point, there was something stronger than all of it. Stronger than fear. Stronger than uncertainty. Stronger even than the enormous leap I had just taken. I love him so much. By the final week, life had begun to settle into something that almost felt like marriage already. On Monday, I spent the day ironing my clothes and putting my things in order while waiting for Dean to come home from work. The hours always seemed to move slowly until I heard him come through the door. That evening, I had supper ready for him, and afterward we went out and played miniature golf together. Nothing about the day was extraordinary. And yet, afterward I wrote, "It was so wonderful just to be near him." That simple sentence probably explained more than anything else I could have written at the time. After months of uncertainty, opposition, separations, and endless conversations about our future, just being together peacefully had begun to feel almost sacred to me. Tuesday passed quietly, too. "Time goes so slow till Dean gets home," I wrote. By then, my days had begun, revolving entirely around him, waiting for him, planning for him, building my life around the rhythm of his. That evening, we drove up into the hills together, talking the way we always did when we were alone in the car, away from everyone else. Somewhere in the middle of ordinary things, A doctor's appointment, supper, evening drives, our separate lives had quietly become one shared life. On Wednesday, I moved into the room behind the house, Dean's room. Even now, that sentence feels larger than the few words I gave it in my diary. It was a crossing over of sorts. I was leaving behind the last pieces of girlhood and stepping fully into the life we had spent 5 whirlwind months rushing toward. We went to bed early that night, and before falling asleep, I wrote simply, "Oh, Dean, I love you so very much." And then came Thursday. The day itself unfolded almost casually, as if neither of us fully grasped how important those ordinary hours would become in memory. I met Dean at the bakery, and together we went to the courthouse to get our marriage license. I remember carefully dressing for the occasion in my white ex-formal dress with white gloves, white shoes, and my white purse. Somehow, all of it mattered to me. I wanted to feel like a bride long before the ceremony actually began. We spent part of the afternoon calling ministers, trying to arrange everything at the last minute, still carrying that mixture of urgency and uncertainty that had followed us through our entire courtship. That evening, Dean took me to Bertola's for dinner. I can still picture the candlelight, the quietness of the restaurant, and the feeling that the world had suddenly narrowed down to just the two of us sitting there together. "It was just so nice," I wrote afterward. At 9 o'clock, we went to the Assembly of God Church. And there, at last, after all the tears, arguments, letters, fears, prayers, jealousy, pressure from parents, and uncertainty about the future, we were married. Well, this is the moment I dreamed of all my life. There is something almost painfully young and sincere in those words to me now. At 19, I truly believed happiness could not possibly grow larger than what I felt in that moment. I've never been so happy or so completely in love. The next morning, Dean went back to work. Life, amazingly, simply continued. And in the final line of my diary, I wrote with all the delight of a teenage bride trying on her new identity for the first time. "Gee, Mrs. Gilbert, doesn't that sound sharp?" Then the diary ended. No farewell paragraph, no dramatic conclusion, just silence. For the next 9 years, there were no more diary entries. Perhaps there was no longer time for them. Life had arrived in full: marriage, work, responsibility, disappointments, joys, children, bills, ordinary days, difficult days, and thousands of moments that never found their way onto paper. But the story written in those 5 months remained. A whirlwind romance between two young people who fell deeply in love, struggled through uncertainty and opposition, and married anyway. And somehow, against all the fears that surrounded them at the beginning. It lasted for 60 years,